Chapter 2042. As soon as she said that, Shenjilia burst into laughter. Shenluo An's face darkened. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifted her up, and put her on the hospital bed. He looked at Shen Manting for a while and couldn't help but say, "Because I'm your man." Shen Manting looked at him with her eyes wide open. "What?" Shenjilia quickly pulled Shenluo and said, "Brother, don't scare her. Leave it to me. You can go out first." Shenluo and took a stool and sat down. "You do what you need to do. I'll sit here." "How can we do that?" Shenjilia frowned, but when he saw the unhappy look on his father's face, he couldn't help but cough softly and curl his lips. "In that case, Dad, please take care of Little Moon for a while." Shen Longyue knew the gravity of the situation. He nodded and said, "Little Moon, let's go." Shen Yueshao didn't comply. He looked at Shen Manting with his big black eyes and said, "Mom." Shen Manting finally saw it clearly. She was shocked and exclaimed, "No way. Is she calling me mommy? When did I have such a big son?" Shen Longyue's heart ached when he heard this. He glanced at Shen Manting and sighed. "Let's go, Little Moon. Come back to see Mom later." Shen Yueshao was reluctant to leave. "Mom, Little Moon will come back to see you tomorrow." Shen Manting heard a childish voice. Shen Manting listened to it and found it familiar. She seemed to hear this sentence every day. She felt a dull pain in her heart. Suddenly, she felt as if she had seen a ghost. She looked at the two men in front of her and sat quietly. Shenluo picked up his recording pen and turned it on. He said, "From now on, I'll ask you a question and you'll answer it. Tell me everything you know and the truth. Do you understand?" Shen Manting looked at Shenluo and then at Shenjilia. She said, "Uncle, will your brother really pay for my medical expenses?" When Shenjilia heard this, he chuckled. "How did you know he was my brother? You called him brother just now, and you called the grandfather just now Dad. Also, you look a little similar, which means that you are biological brothers, the sons of the grandfather just now." She then rubbed her stomach and said, "I'm so hungry. I'm so hungry that I don't have any strength left in me." Shenjilia felt relieved. At the very least, his IQ wasn't low. Shenjilia took a few notes in his notebook and said, "I'll get you something to eat later. Answer the question first. How old are you? 12 years old? A 12-year-old calls me uncle. Do I look that old?" Shenluo asked suddenly. Shenjilia almost burst out laughing. It seemed that Shenluo was very bothered by the way she addressed him as uncle. However, he immediately coughed lightly and said, "Brother, please keep quiet." Shenluo immediately fell silent. Shen Manting said, "You look like you're in your 30s. Although you're not particularly old, you're much older than me." Yes, this was the 12-year-old Shen Manting. Shenjilia made a few notes in the notebook and asked, "Do you remember what you were doing before you passed out?" "Of course I remember." Shen Manting looked a little sad and said without hesitation, "The director asked me to help him buy soy sauce and go back to cook. But when I went back, I tripped and the soy sauce bottle broke. I was beaten by the director's aunt. When I woke up, I was in the hospital." Shenjilia frowned and looked up. He asked, "Do you remember what your name is?" "Hyunsuan." "How do you write it?" Chapter 2043. Shenjilia and Shenluo both looked at her. Shen Manting shrank back under their stares and asked in a low voice, "What's wrong? Have you always been called this name?" Shenjilia asked. As he spoke, he looked at Shen Manting's expression and added, "Tell me the truth." Shen Manting frowned when she heard this and said, "This is my name, not Shen Manting. When I was young, I was abandoned on the street. They didn't even give me a birthday card. Later, an old man who picked up garbage sent me to an orphanage." Shenluo was silent. Shenjilia nodded and asked, "And then?" "Then the old man said that since he didn't raise me, why did he give birth to me? So, the director gave me this name. Hyunsuan. She gave a child such a name. Why did she allow it to exist?" Shenluo felt a little pain in his heart. He realized that he knew nothing about her. "Do you know Zhang Meifang?" Xinjilia recorded in his notebook and looked up at Manting. Yes, Manting nodded. She's my good friend, but the director likes her very much. She's beautiful and sensible. Xinjilia and Luo and looked at each other. They both saw a trace of doubt in each other's eyes. What's wrong? Manting looked at them and suddenly looked a little sad. She asked in a low voice, "Did you find the wrong person? Is the person you're looking for actually Meifang?" "No, we're looking for you." Xinjilia tapped the back of his hand with the pen and said slowly, "Have you seen me?" "Have you seen him?" "What do you usually like to eat?" Manting exclaimed. When she heard this, she covered her growling stomach and said, "I'm actually not picky. I eat anything." Luo and suddenly asked, "Do you eat onions?" Manting's face immediately fell. "No." "Do you eat coriander?" "No," Luo and smiled lightly. "Then why did you say you eat anything?" Manting was speechless. He asked a few more questions. Manting did not hesitate and readily followed his advice. But when she asked about Manting, there was an obvious look of doubt on her face. "Who is Yuesha? Who is Luo Un? Who is Xinjilia? I don't know anyone." "All right," Xinjilia said as he put the notebook away. "I have a general understanding of the situation. Now, I have something to tell you. Don't be too shocked." "What?" Manting looked at him curiously with an innocent look on her face. She was completely different from the usual Manting. Xinjilia paused for a moment, then stood up and said, "Give me a moment." After walking out for a few minutes, he came back with a mirror in his hand. He handed it to Manting and said, "Take a look at yourself." When Manting saw this, she was baffled. He took it and looked at it. He turned pale with fright. Manting flung the mirror away and asked in horror, "Who is this?" This kind of reaction was a little too big. Luo and didn't expect this and couldn't sit still. He picked up the mirror and said, "This is Manting. She's my sister-in-law and the mother of my nephew. She's 31 years old and lives in the capital. She's been an orphan since she was young." Chapter 2044. However, as soon as Manting finished speaking, she found that the eyes of the two men in front of her remained unchanged. Manting was shocked and suddenly felt a little like crying. She pursed her lips and burst into tears. "You're lying to me. I haven't aged. This isn't me at all. I'm only 12 years old." Xinjilia glanced at Luo and then sighed softly. "Brother, we can't go on like this." Luo and also had a headache and said, "You go ahead. Leave it to me. I'm afraid that you can't handle it." She seems to have lost her memory from the age of 12 to 29. It's a whole 17 years. "You." Manting had a bad feeling and looked at them. "Didn't you say that I was 31 years old?" Xinjilia looked at her with a little sympathy in his eyes. "You had a car accident when you were 29. Your hands and feet were broken, and your head was severely injured. You've been lying in bed for 2 years. What?" Manting couldn't believe it. "You mean I've been in the hospital for 2 years? How much money is that?" Xinjilia was speechless. She turned around and patted Luo and on the shoulder. "Communicate well and guide her. I'll go ahead." "Okay." Luo and responded. His eyes calmly fell on Manting. He slowly said, "You're the mother of my child. It's my duty to take care of you." "What?" Manting felt dizzy. "I haven't grown up and I'm not married. How could I have a child? Unfortunately, you did." Luo and walked over and poured her a glass of water. "What do you want for dinner?" Manting immediately straightened up. "So, you're my husband. I want to have a big meal. Is that okay?" "Husband," Luo and was caught off guard. The words suddenly rippled in his heart. He looked at her with his amber eyes and said slowly, "Yes." Manting suddenly became excited and said, "Then, husband, I want to have a big meal. The kind that needs to be cut with a knife and fork." Her eyes were dark and bright, pure and clean, with expectation and desire. Luo An's heart ached. He handed the water to her and said, "Drink some water first." Shen Manting took the water from him and gulped it down. Are we going to have a feast? She asked. Not yet. Shen Manting was disappointed. What? It's all a lie. You made me call you hubby. Give it back to me. He explained. You've just woken up, so your body can't handle it yet. When you're better, I'll take you to whatever you want to eat. Really? Shen Manting looked at him expectantly. You promised. Yes, I will. Shen Luo nodded. I'll ask my family to prepare a nutritious meal for you. Sure. Shen Manting's eyes sparkled. He was secretly delighted. It seemed like it was pretty good. This uncle looked quite handsome, nice, and had a good personality. The most important thing was that she didn't have to be scolded by Uncle Dean, and she didn't have to deal with the people in the orphanage. She rolled her eyes and looked at Shen Luo. Then, hubby, can I ask you a question? Hubby, it was another word that caught him off guard. Shen Luo straightened up and answered in a low voice, yes. We've already given birth to a child. Have we kissed? Shen Luo looked at her again, perhaps because such a question was too childish. Chapter 2045. Shen Luo glanced at her a few more times because her question was too childish. Shen Manting shrank back and whispered, I swore that my first kiss would be reserved for my Prince Charming. Her silly and cute words made the soft part of Shen Luo restless for a moment. He moved an inch and leaned toward her. Shen Manting subconsciously shrank back, but in the next moment, Shen Luo had already reached out and clamped her chin, accurately capturing her lips. The soft and smooth touch was immediately transmitted from his lips. Shen Manting's eyes widened, but soon she closed them again. Shen Luo had never felt like this before. It turned out that Shen Manting would be so obedient when he kissed her. He couldn't help but ask for more. He gently pried open her lips and teeth, captured her softness, and slowly invaded. After an unknown period of time, Shen Manting couldn't stand it anymore. She gently pushed him away, and Shen Luo released her. Shen Manting immediately panted, and her cheeks were a little red. She looked at him shyly. Shen Luo was even more confused. He couldn't help but move closer and look at her deeply. Shen Manting shrank back, then lay on the bed and covered her head with the quilt. Her voice came from under the quilt, and it was a little muffled. Honey, I don't want to have children anymore. After she had a big meal, she would consider whether to continue kissing her biological child. However, she was so hungry now. Kissing shouldn't make her pregnant, right? Shen Manting was a little uncertain. She lifted the quilt and revealed one eye. At a glance, she saw Shen Luo standing. Shen Luo looked at her with a deep gaze. He was a little sad and glad. Shen Manting suddenly felt that he was very pitiful. She whispered, Honey, are you very sad? When Shen Luo heard this, he suddenly smiled and said, No. Then why do you look so sad? Shen Manting looked at him with a little guilt and apology. She whispered, But I still want to say, don't kiss me in the future. What if I get pregnant? I don't want to have children. I heard that giving birth is very painful. Very painful. It can even kill people. Shen Manting thought of this and shrank back. When Shen Luo heard this, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Who told you that kissing will make you pregnant? Ah, Shen Manting's face was burning with embarrassment. She covered her face with the blanket in embarrassment and whispered, That's what everyone says, Shen Luo, and let out a rare laugh. He moved closer and whispered, I won't, but I'm your Prince Charming. Our child is already 2 years old. You have to call me hubby from now on. Do you understand? Perhaps it was because Shen Luo was so close to her that she felt her heart warm up. Her face was also hot. She nodded and said, Yes, I know, hubby. Shen Luo's heart softened, and tears welled up in his eyes. He turned around and said, I'll make the call. Shen Manting looked at his back and suddenly felt a little sad. This feeling came out of nowhere. It was a little scary, but at the same time, there was satisfaction and excitement. This feeling seemed to be instinctive. Even she herself did not know what she was sad about, excited about, or satisfied about. He stayed in the hospital for 3 days. After 3 days, when the doctors confirmed that she was physically and mentally fit to be discharged, Enchanting returned to the so-called home. It was a beautiful and luxurious house. She had never seen such a big and beautiful house. Chapter 2046. Enchanting was a little frightened. It wasn't that she hadn't seen this child in the past few days, but it was still very difficult for her to accept that such a large meatball had actually popped out from her stomach. She looked at him and squatted down. Shen Yueshao also looked at her. The mother and son looked at each other for a long time. The little fellow stretched out his arms and shouted, "Mommy, hug me." Enchanting's heart suddenly softened. Her lips unconsciously curled into a smile, and she reached out to hug him. Manting is back. Nanny's eyes were slightly red. "I'm glad you're back. I'm glad you're back." Enchanting blinked her eyes in confusion. Shen Luo and reminded her, "This is Nanny He." "Hello, Nanny He." Enchanting greeted her obediently and quickly followed Shen Luo and into the room with the infant in her arms. "This is our room." Shen Luo and stood up straight and pointed to a small bed inside. "The baby sleeps there." Enchanting nodded. "Are we going to sleep here?" As he spoke, he walked over and looked at the big bed. But when she turned around, she saw Shen Luo and's slightly strange expression. Enchanting thought she had said something wrong. She hugged the baby and shrank her head. She whispered, "Aren't Daddy and Mommy supposed to sleep together?" She didn't have parents, but the parents of other children slept in the same room, on the same bed. Shen Luo and's eyes softened. He nodded slightly. "Yes." Enchanting breathed a sigh of relief. She sat down with the baby in her arms and said, "What a big bed. I've never slept in such a big bed before. Wow, it's so bouncy and comfortable." "Manting, you're back?" An old man's voice rang out. Enchanting felt a sense of familiarity when she heard it. She put the baby down, stood up and walked out. When she saw the old woman walking toward her, she greeted, "Grandma." Old Mrs. Shen immediately rushed forward and hugged Enchanting with reddened eyes. "It's good that you're back. It's good that you're back. You're finally out of the hospital. Let Luo and take you out for a walk." "Yeah." Enchanting smiled slyly and said, "Hubby said he's taking me out for a feast today." "Hubby?" Nanny, he couldn't help turning around to take a second look at the way she addressed him. The others had already seen how thorough Enchanting's amnesia was, so they were not surprised by it. Old Mrs. Shen nodded and said, "All right, go ahead then. Luo, take good care of Manting." Shen Luo and chuckled. "I won't be bringing little Moon along. Just watch." "Okay." Old Mrs. Shen's eyes curved into crescents as she smiled. Manting was finally as obedient as she was now. Of course, he had to create more opportunities for them to be alone together. He took Enchanting for a stroll around the neighborhood of the house. Everything he saw was new and interesting. She didn't reject Shen Luo and holding her hand. His palm was soft and warm. She was just too skinny. "Let's go." But Enchanting agreed happily and got into his car. "Hubby, will it be just the two of us?" "Yes." Shen Luo and glanced at her, his eyes full of tenderness. "This is called a world of the two of us." Enchanting blushed when she heard that. She asked in a low voice, "Are we going on a date?" Shen Luo chuckled. He leaned over and said, "Yes, come closer." Chapter 2047. Shen Luo Anne's heart warmed when he saw her pouting little mouth in front of him. He lowered his head slightly and gently kissed her lips. He gently held her in his arms and felt her obviously too thin body. His heart ached a little. He reached out and pulled the seat belt behind her. He let go of her and said, "I'll take you to eat your favorite food." Enchanting's cheeks were red and she was very happy. She nodded and looked at Shen Luo, and with a pair of shining eyes. She said sincerely, "Honey, you're so nice. Honey, you're so nice." It was impossible for Enchanting to utter those words, but she could hear them clearly from the side. Shen Luo Anne's hands trembled slightly when he buckled her seatbelt. If she knew how much she used to hate him, would she still say such words? Would she still say good things about him? Would she still call him husband? There was no doubt about the answer. But soon it returned to normal. Let's go. But the car drove steadily to the Western restaurant that Enchanting used to like to go to in the past. He ordered her favorite dishes. Enchanting looked around curiously, as if she had never seen it before. She leaned forward and whispered, "Honey, is our family very rich?" Shenluo chuckled. "Why do you ask? One look and you can tell that this is a very expensive place. I just looked at the menu and it costs more than $500 for a steak. It's so expensive. When I was obedient, Uncle Dean only gave me 10 cents to buy candy." Enchanting felt a little wronged as she spoke. But soon she covered her mouth and said timidly, "Honey, am I too childish?" Shenluo felt a slight pain in his heart and looked at her sadly. He shook his head against his will and said, "No, it's very good." Enchanting vaguely felt that he was lying. But she didn't expose him. Nodding his head, he quietly sat up straight and still. Soon, the dishes were served. There was only one steak on a very fragrant and high-end plate. Enchanting opened her eyes wide but didn't say anything. After the waiter left, she said, "Honey, it's even more beautiful than what I saw on TV." Shenluo chuckled and picked up the knife and fork. "Come on, I'll teach you how to cut it." "Yes." Enchanting beamed. She looked at Shenluo's expression and demonstrated it to him, and he quickly followed her advice. Just like she knew how to use it. After a hearty meal, Shenluo and Enchanting went shopping. He bought a lot of clothes. Enchanting was too thin now. After choosing 2 sets of clothes, she tugged at Shenluo and said, "Honey, I've just woken up. The smallest one is already too big for me. Don't buy it now. I'll buy it again when I gain some weight." Shenluo nodded with a smile. Returning home was a rewarding journey. Shen Yueshao had already fallen asleep. Shenluo and Enchanting crept into the room quietly. "Go take a shower first." "I'll get you your pajamas," Shenluo said. "Okay." Enchanting didn't dare to speak too loudly and quickly walked into the bathroom. However, he was dazzled by the spacious bathroom and exclaimed, "It's too big." Shenluo was holding her pajamas. When he heard this, he smiled and asked, "Do you know how to shower?" Enchanting looked at him as if he was retarded. "Do you think I'm stupid?" She took the pajamas and pushed him out. "Don't peek at me." The smile on Shenluo's face widened. He nodded with a smile and said, "I'll wait for you." Enchanting's face turned red. Chapter 2048. Her heart was beating fast. Enchanting was in a good mood. She hummed a tune, took off her clothes, and entered the shower room. She turned on the water and tested the temperature before she suddenly realized that something was wrong. When she was in the orphanage, she used to boil water for bathing. Why did she know how to use such an advanced thing here? Enchanting suddenly felt a little excited and muttered, "It seems that I'm really a genius." While she was happily bathing, she touched her small chest. The bulge seemed so big. She couldn't hold it with one hand. She was so thin, how did it grow? After bathing awkwardly, she found that her body was different everywhere. After a while, Enchanting put on clean pajamas and walked out. Her wet hair was wrapped up. Shenluo didn't know what he was doing. When he saw her come out, he seemed to hide something under the quilt. Enchanting blushed and shouted, "Honey, what are you doing?" "Nothing." Shenluo stood up. "Dry your hair. Don't catch a cold." "I won't." Enchanting waved her arm. "There's a heater in the room. It's not cold. Sit down." Enchanting sat on the bed and couldn't help but look under the quilt curiously. Shenluo noticed her little movement, but he pretended not to see it. He removed the towel from her head and slowly dried her hair. The heater in the room was on, and soon her hair was half dry. Shenluo quickly went to take a shower, and Enchanting immediately reached out to the quilt. She felt a small box. The box was made of black velvet and felt smooth and comfortable. She opened the box, and inside was a ring. It was a big, shiny diamond in the shape of a heart. Enchanting's eyes lit up. She couldn't help but pick it up and put it on her finger. Almost automatically, she put it on the ring finger of her left hand. There was no flesh on her finger, so it was easy to put on. It was very loose and dangled on her finger. But for some reason, she suddenly felt an unknown place in her heart began to ache. She suddenly felt a little sad. She stared at the ring, and her eyes were a little hot. An urge to cry was difficult to suppress. It came crazily, but inexplicably. He quietly put the ring back and continued to stuff it under the blanket, pretending that he had not touched it at all. But when she fell onto the bed, she couldn't help but burst into tears. She whimpered softly. Her heart was empty, very empty. When Shenluo came out, Shenmanting was already asleep on the bed. The position was in the middle. The lights were still on, very bright. However, she was sleeping soundly. Her even breathing could be heard, almost in sync with her son's. He walked up quietly and subconsciously touched the ring he had just placed on the table. It's still there. He was a little disappointed, but he quickly placed the ring in the drawer of the bedside table. He turned off the lights and lay down. There was a faint sense of satisfaction and joy in his heart. He reached out and gently pulled her into his embrace. Shenmanting was asleep. When she sensed his breath, she couldn't help but lean forward and reach out to grab his clothes. "Honey, I feel so sad." Shenluo's body stiffened. He placed his hand on her cheek and asked softly, "What's wrong?" Chapter 2049. Shenluo's body stiffened when he heard this. His heart ached and he looked down at her face. The room was dark, but he could still clearly feel the tears on Shenmanting's face. She was different from before. She was different at all. In the past, Shenmanting would cry with a smile. It was ugly and cruel. But now, she was crying. She was just crying. She was different. She was different. Shenluo silently pulled her into his arms and hugged her tightly. Shenmanting subconsciously leaned over and wrapped her arms around him. She rubbed against his chest. His body smelled faintly of shampoo. It was warm. Shenluo gently patted her back and whispered, "Don't think about anything. Go to sleep." Shenmanting closed her eyes and soon fell into a deep sleep. Shenluo hugged her and his heart ached. He closed his eyes, but his mind was in a mess and he couldn't sleep. Early morning. Shenmanting's body ached from sleeping and she stretched. But when she turned around, she saw Shenluo looking at her. His amber eyes were clear and quiet. Shenmanting was startled and her body twitched. Then she shrank back and her cheeks were a little hot. "Good morning, honey." Shenluo smiled and said, "Good morning." Shenmanting immediately got up and went to the bathroom. She closed the door and was in a good mood. After washing up, she walked out and saw Shenluo dressing the child. Shen Yueshao saw Shenmanting coming out and called out with a smile, "Mom." Shenmanting walked over and touched the little boy's head. "Good boy." The little boy was a little happy. He opened his arms and rubbed them in Shenmanting's direction. "Give me a hug." Shenmanting squatted down and picked up the little boy. "Let's go. Mom will take you to dinner." "Okay." Shen Yueshao was very happy and hugged Shenmanting's neck. Shenluo smiled with relief when he saw it, but then he reminded her, "You haven't brushed your teeth yet. Help little Moon brush his teeth first." Shenmanting was shocked. "He's so young and he's already brushing his teeth? Of course you have to brush your teeth. It won't hurt so much when you're changing your teeth." Shenluo tapped her nose. "You have to instill good education and habits in your child." "Oh." Shenmanting held the baby in her arms. "Let's go then. Does he know how to do it?" "Yes." Little Moon had already spoken up. "Mommy, I can brush my teeth." Shenmanting couldn't help but exclaim, "He's indeed a doctor's child." She carried him into the bathroom and said, "Let's go." From today onwards, she would learn to be a good mother. Be a good mother. No matter what, she must have given birth to this child. Otherwise, how could he look so much like her? Moreover, he was adorable no matter how she looked at him. She could get a son without having to suffer any pain. It was worth it. But just as this thought flashed through his mind, he heard the child's voice. "P. Shen Manting froze and looked at him. Little Moon pouted and said, "Mommy, pee." She looked at Shen Luo and said, "Dear, the baby wants to pee." Shen Luo and chuckled when he saw her pleading look. He took the baby from her arms and said, "Go and have breakfast first. I'll clean up for your baby." "Okay," Shen Manting replied and turned around. She felt sweet inside and said, "I'll wait for you." Chapter 2050. When Shen Manting walked out, the whole family was already outside. A young woman was sitting next to Shenjilia. She looked very lively and beautiful. When she saw Shen Manting, her eyes lit up and she exclaimed, "Manting!" Shen Manting was a little flattered. She stepped back and said, I'm Yi Qianqian, Qianqian." Yi Qianqian pointed to herself and then to Shenjilia, Shenjilia's wife. As she spoke, she hugged Shen Manting excitedly. "You're finally awake. That's great." Yi Qianqian's eyes were a little red. She patted her back and said in a choked voice, "Everything will be fine." Shen Manting suddenly didn't know how to react. She laughed and said, "Cici, I'm hungry." "Oh." Yi Qianqian immediately released her and smiled happily. "Well, let's eat together." Yi Qianqian held Shen Manting's hand and walked to the table. Shen Manting looked around and called out, "Dad, Mom, Grandma." The people who were called all smiled. Mrs. Shen smiled and said, "Don't be so formal at home. Look at how thin you are." Old Mrs. Shen's heart ached for her. She handed her a bowl and asked, "When will your body be as fair and plump as it used to be?" Shen Manting glanced at her body. Fair and plump? She had never experienced what it felt like to be fair and plump. So, she had been fair and plump before? Shen Manting sat down and nodded. She was a little touched. When they were halfway through eating, Shen Luo came out with his son. Little Moon was bouncing up and down. When he saw Shen Manting, he called out, "Mom." Shen Manting's eyes softened and she nodded. Shen Luo carried him to the dining table and sat down. He said, "Who else hasn't been called?" "Grandpa, Grandma." After greeting Grandpa and Grandma in a childish voice, his eyes fell on old Mrs. Shen. He blinked and called out, "Grandma." Shen Luo chuckled and pinched his little face. He corrected, "Great-grandma." "Take Grandma." He shouted loudly, but it wasn't accurate. Everyone laughed. Old Mrs. Shen smiled and gave him a cup of soy milk. "Say it again." "Take Grandma." Yi Qianqian couldn't stop laughing and asked, "What about me? What about me?" Little Moon tilted his head and thought for a moment, but he still didn't know what to say. He looked at Shen Luo for help. "Daddy?" Shen Luo chuckled and greeted, "Aunt." Little Moon called out softly, "Synth." "Auntie," Yi Qianqian corrected her. "Lift your tongue, Auntie." Little Moon looked a little helpless, as if he knew that he had called out the wrong name. He shrunk his head and whispered, "Synth." Yi Qianqian gave up and gave him a small bun. "Be good." Xiao Yu took it from her and beamed with joy. Shen Luo bowed his head and said, "Thank you, Aunt." Xiesensen. The whole family couldn't help but laugh. Shenjilia finally walked over and chuckled helplessly. Calling Mom and Dad is quite smooth, but calling anyone else is no good. "Uncle." Little Moon looked at Shenjilia excitedly and called out to him. Shenjilia laughed and said, "You're smart." Little Moon knew that he had been praised and swung his legs happily. "Our Little Moon can talk about other things." Shen Luo sat beside him and said, "What do you want to say to Mommy?" Little Moon smiled and pointed at Shen Luo. Then he shouted, "Mommy, Little Moon is here to see you." Chapter 2051. It was a very familiar sentence. It was as if she had heard it countless times when she was asleep. After the young child finished speaking, he laughed happily. He took a bite of the little bun in his hand and smiled happily. She felt a lump in her throat and had the urge to cry. Shen Luo seemed to notice Shen Manting's gaze and looked at her. His eyes were a little soft and he looked at her with a smile on his face. After breakfast, Shen Luo handed the baby to Yi Qianqian. After getting her full assurance, he led Shen Manting out. Shen Manting sat in the driver's seat. This time she had learned to be smart. She buckled her seatbelt and looked at Shen Luo. Honey, where are we going today? To the orphanage. Shen Luo and glanced at her. Back to the orphanage. Shen Manting opened her eyes wide and said, Are we going to the orphanage? Shen Manting was a little scared after getting a positive answer. She slid her hand on the seatbelt and asked, Why are we going back? To find your good friend. Shen Luo and looked at her. Do you remember what you told me your name? Shen Manting felt a little strange when she heard this. After thinking for a while, she said, He Yun Suin. Was that your name when you were in the orphanage? Shen Manting nodded and looked at the expression on Shen Luo An's face. She felt a little scared and asked, What's wrong? What about Zhang Meifeng? She is my good friend. Shen Manting was very sure. Honey, you have asked this question twice. The last time was in the ward a few days ago. He and Shen Jilia were asking this question. When it came to this question, both of their expressions didn't look too good. They were indescribably solemn. Could it be that there was a problem? Shen Manting looked at him, but Shen Luo and didn't say anything. He said, Sit tight. Shen Manting was already seated. I'm ready. Shen Luo and glanced at her, started the car and sped away. By the time they arrived at the orphanage, almost an hour had passed. During this hour, Shen Manting looked out of the window and played with her phone from time to time. He stopped the car and turned off the GPS. We're here, he said. Shen Manting looked up and exclaimed, Hubby, why has this place become so run down? It's been 19 years. Of course it will change. Shen Luo and unbuckled his seatbelt. Let's go. When Shen Manting got out of the car, the sun was blazing. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the two children sitting at the door. The two children looked to be only 5 or 6 years old. When they saw Shen Luo An's car, their eyes lit up in surprise. Shen Manting felt a little sour in her heart. Finally, I'm not the one looking at other people's cars. Now these children are also looking at my car. She caught up with him, held his arm and asked, Hubby, is the director still around? Shen Luo An asked. Is the director still around? Yes. Shen Luo An glanced at her. Do you remember which room it was? Shen Manting nodded and pulled Shen Luo An into the yard. The children were running around and playing games. Seeing these two strangers dressed so well, they couldn't help but take a few more glances. Director! Shen Manting shouted. Is the director around? Chapter 2052. Are you the dean? Shen Manting looked at the man in front of her, who was about the same age as Shen Luo and was surprised. The man looked at her and said, The dean is resting at the moment. Why are you looking for him? Shen Manting breathed a sigh of relief and said, I used to live here, and now I'm back to look for him. Oh. The man looked at Shen Manting and said, Who are you? Why do you look so familiar? However, he was too thin. He looked so thin that he was out of shape. She couldn't recognize him at all. When Shen Manting heard this, she smiled and said, Do you know me? I'm He Yunsuin. The man looked at her in surprise and said, Yunsuin? Really? Why is he so thin? Yes. Shen Manting looked as usual, then glanced at Shen Luo, took his arm and said, This is my husband, Shen Luo. He's a scientist. The man was even more surprised. A scientist? No. Shen Luo and pressed Shen Manting's hand. I'm just researching some medicine. Is the old dean here? Oh, he's sleeping. The old man hasn't been in good health recently. The man kept glancing at Shen Manting as he spoke and said, Yunsuin has become so big. Time flies. Do you still remember who I am? Shen Manting looked at him with her eyes wide open and frowned. She vaguely felt that he was a little familiar, but the difference from when he was a child was too big. Shen Manting couldn't recognize who he was at all. The man laughed and said, Don't you remember me? I'm He Junxing. He Junxing? Shen Manting covered her mouth. No way, how is it possible? He Junxing touched his head with a little embarrassment. Yes, I've changed a little. Come on in and sit down. Shen Manting's face was still full of disbelief when she led the two in. Isn't he Junxing, the silly little brother from before? You look so smart now. Shen Manting's memory stopped at the age of 12, so she didn't have many words in her mind. What he said at this moment was the truth of the heavens. He Junxing felt even more embarrassed and said, yes? Shen Luo, Anne's lips curved into a smile. He pressed Shen Manting down and said, she got into a car accident 2 years ago and was hospitalized for 2 years. She has some memory problems and can only remember things from before she was 12 years old. He Junxing was stunned for a moment, then he looked at Shen Manting with understanding in his eyes. He looked at her sympathetically and said, Yunsuan is a very smart person. The headmaster likes him very much. I'll go see if the headmaster has woken up. Wait a minute, Shen Luo, and stopped him. Since you grew up with her, you should know a lot about her. Let's talk first. He Junxing looked at Shen Manting and nodded. Have a seat. I'll make you some tea. Shen Luo and was indeed a little thirsty, so he didn't refuse. Shen Manting made herself at home and pulled Shen Luo and to sit on the bone stool. The decoration of the house was very old, and the furniture seemed to be from more than 10 years ago. Shen Manting looked around and suddenly stood up. She said, Hubby, Mei Fang and I drew a butterfly here. Come and take a look. Shen Luo and stood up and walked over. Sure enough, he saw the shallow marks. There were 2 butterflies, one crooked and the other dancing. There was a signature at the bottom, and it was written Zhang Meifang at the bottom. On the butterfly that looked slightly better, it was written He Yunsuan. There was also a smiling face at the bottom. The marks were very shallow, and it was obvious that a long time had passed. The orphanage was not big, and the decoration was very old. Shen Luo and looked around and saw that He Junxing had already brought the tea set. Shen Luo and pulled Shen Manting back to sit down. He Junxing smiled and said, It's been a long time since we had a guest. The tea set was left for a while, and it was just washed. After boiling the water, He Junxing looked at Shen Manting and said, She just woke up, didn't she? She's too thin. Yes, she woke up a few days ago. Shen Luo and looked at him. But, are you sure she's He Yunsuan? Yes. He Junxing looked at her. She's witty and clever. She's obviously powerful. Who else could it be if not Yunsuan? Then, what about Zhang Meifang? Shen Luo and asked. At the mention of this name, He Junxing was quite emotional. Meifang is quiet and seems to be quiet. She's not very smart. Compared to Yunsuan, she's far behind. Where is she? She disappeared when she was a teenager. I don't know where she went. At that time, I called the police and looked for the surveillance cameras, but they couldn't find her anywhere. He Junxing disinfected the tea set when the water was boiling. It's a pity. Meifang is kind and good-looking. Back then, my grandmother came to adopt her. Shen Luo and looked at him. At that time, she found someone based on her horoscope, and the person she adopted was Zhang Meifang. He Junxing's teacup trembled and the cup fell. The boiling water splashed and sprayed Shen Manting's fingers. Shen Manting shrank her hand in pain and hurriedly covered it. Shen Luo and was shocked. He pulled her hand over and quickly checked it. Are you okay? I'm fine. Shen Manting was a little embarrassed. She pushed his hand away and looked at He Junxing. Junxing, can't you find Meifang now? He Junxing suddenly looked a little flustered and said, Who's here? A slightly old voice was heard. An old man who looked to be in his 50s or 60s walked over. Shen Manting recognized him at a glance. Uncle Dean. She stood up and walked over to him to help him. When Uncle Dean saw Shen Manting, he was stunned. You are Yunsuan. Shen Manting said her name without any hesitation. The moment she said it, the look on the dean's face changed a little. He subconsciously glanced at Shen Luo and asked, Who is this? My husband. Shen Manting smiled and helped the old man to sit down beside the chair. Long time no see. Yes, long time no see. The dean smiled, but he looked a little uncomfortable. I haven't been here for a long time. You're here for, Dean, I want to know where Zhang Meifang is. The dean's expression changed. Zhang Meifeng, He Junsheng looked at him and frowned. Dean, it's okay. Meifeng was adopted. The dean felt a little guilty. She hasn't been back for many years. Didn't she get lost? Shen Luo and asked. Mr. He just said that Zhang Meifeng got lost when she was a teenager. Moreover, you said that she was adopted. When she became an adult, she was adopted by our family again. What's going on? The person they wanted to adopt was Zhang Meifeng. Chapter 2053. The person they wanted to adopt was Zhang Meifeng. In the end, they adopted He Yunsuan instead. Grandma would never lie to her family, so there was only one explanation. Grandma had been deceived. According to He Junsheng, Zhang Meifeng had long been lost. In the end, when Grandma went to look for her, the orphanage replaced Zhang Meifeng with He Yunsuan. Why did they do that? The director was sweating profusely when he heard this. He panicked and said, My name is Shen Luo. Shen Luo, and took out his business card. The director held the white business card in his hand and couldn't help but feel nervous. My grandmother adopted a girl named Zhang Meifeng from this orphanage. As Shen Luo and spoke, he paid close attention to the director's expression. My grandmother firmly believed that she was my missing sister, who had been missing for more than 10 years. When she came to look for her, she brought along her birth date. Later, when she did a paternity test, she discovered that she had nothing to do with our family. The director looked up at him and said, Maybe it was a mistake. Yes, we thought so too, Shen Luo, and said slowly. But this time, Manting got into a car accident and was bedridden for 2 years. When she woke up, she only remembered things before she was 12 years old and believed that her name was He Yunsuan. Then what about Zhang Meifeng? The more the director listened, the more nervous he became. He Junsheng looked at the director and sighed softly. Uncle Director, I just told him that Meifeng went missing when she was 14 years old. The director looked at He Junsheng in disbelief. You? He Junsheng lowered his head guiltily. I forgot about that for a moment. I'm sorry. Sigh. The director put down the business card and looked sad. Mr. Shin, I'm sorry. What do you mean? When she was ready to adopt Meifeng, she had already gone missing. At that time, she used Meifeng's date of birth to look for her. The director looked sad. At that time, the orphanage was poor. She said that if she could find her granddaughter, she would give us 100,000 yuan as a token of appreciation. So you lied to my grandmother? Shen Luo, and frowned slightly. Does the date of birth that my grandmother provided match Meifeng's? The president nodded. That's right. At that time, I was muddle-headed. I wanted the $100,000, and I wanted Yun Siyuan to live a good life. So I asked Yun Siyuan to pretend to be Meifeng and go to your house. As he spoke, he looked at Shen Manting. Shen Manting's eyes were already brimming with tears. What about Meifeng? I don't know. The director shook his head. She was a young girl at that time. It's normal for her to be kidnapped and sold. After returning from the orphanage, Shen Manting was in low spirits. On his way here, he looked left and right. But when Shen Manting returned, she was speechless. She looked at Shen Luo and asked, Honey, is it possible that Meifeng is your biological sister? Shen Luo and glanced at Shen Manting and nodded. Yes. Does that mean I can't be called Shen Manting anymore? Shen Manting looked at Shen Luo and said, The real Shen Manting is Meifeng, and I'm a fake. It's just like what they say on TV. We were replaced by a leopard cat. I'm the leopard cat, and Meifeng is the crown prince. Chapter 2054. I'm not Shen Manting either. Shen Manting was a little disappointed. I'm used to it. You all call me Manting, but Manting is gone. Can I still be Manting? Shen Luo sighed softly and glanced at her sideways. He held the steering wheel with one hand and held her hand with the other. Looking at the road ahead, he said slowly, What are you talking about? No matter who you used to be, or who the real Shen Manting is, you are you now. You are Shen Manting. I'm just here to take a look because I'm a genius. Honey, will you still be my husband in the future? Shen Manting looked at him with a pair of big eyes full of doubt and expectation. Shen Luo An's heart fluttered when he suddenly heard this. He turned his head and looked into her dark and clear eyes. He felt a little choked. After a long time, he said softly, "As long as you want, we will always be husband and wife." Shen Manting's originally gloomy mood suddenly became joyful. With a smile on her face, she lowered her head and played with the hem of her dress. She said happily, "Of course I want to. We will always be husband and wife." Shen Luo An looked at her deeply and looked away. There was a dull pain in his chest, and his hands trembled slightly. Looking at the bright sky ahead, he said tentatively and pleadingly, "Then let's go to the Civil Affairs Bureau tomorrow." Shen Manting didn't hear clearly. "Honey, what did you say?" Looking at her clear and innocent eyes, Shen Luo An's courage suddenly shrank. His throat was a little dry, and he said, "Nothing." It was already afternoon when they returned to the city. Shen Manting was hungry, so he took her out for dinner. It was already 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon when they returned home. Because Shen Manting woke up, Shen Luo and hadn't been to the laboratory for several days. Old Fifth made one call after another. In the end, Shen Luo and couldn't win against Lao Wu. He had to leave Shen Manting at home and go out. Before going out, Shen Manting seemed to be a little flustered and called out, "Honey." Shen Luo and turned around. "What's wrong? When will you be back?" "At night." Shen Luo and rubbed her little head and said softly, "I'll try to come back as soon as possible." "Oh." Shen Manting looked a little disappointed. "Can't you bring me along?" "Be good and stay at home. It'll be fine." Shen Luo and looked a little helpless. "You can spend some time with your son. You're his mother. You need to nurture your relationship with him." "All right." Shen Manting finally felt a little relieved. She tugged at his clothes reluctantly and said, "Then, come back soon." Shen Luo and let go of her hand and turned around. But before he could take 2 steps, he heard another shout from behind, "Hubby." He turned around and saw Shen Manting running towards him with a flushed face. Shen Manting stood on her tiptoes and kissed him on the lips. "I'll wait for you to come back," she said. Shen Luo An's heart was itching. He couldn't help it. He held her head with one hand and kissed her on the lips. His nimble and powerful tongue probed into her mouth and gently pried open her pearly white teeth. It pierced in slightly, tyrannically and greedily rolling her out, holding her tightly to him. His kiss was a little forceful. Shen Manting had never experienced such a feeling before. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. Chapter 2055. Shen Manting's heartbeat quickened, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around his waist. Shen Luo and couldn't help but push her against the door. Cough, cough. The woman's coughing successfully pulled him back to reality. When he released her, he noticed that her face was completely red. Wiping the water from the corner of his mouth, he lowered his head slightly. Shen Luo An's Adam's apple tightened when he saw her expression. Damn it. His body, which had been empty for 3 years, began to heat up uncontrollably. He looked behind Shen Manting and immediately saw Yi Qianqian. Yi Qianqian looked at him suggestively and said, "Big brother, isn't it a little inconvenient to do this at the doorstep? Why don't we return to our room?" Shen Manting's face turned even redder. She turned around and glared at Yi Qianqian shyly. She stomped her feet and said, "You're so mean." Her coquettish voice carried the annoyance and coquettishness of a young girl. Shen Luo An's heart melted as he listened. Yi Qianqian was stunned and subconsciously looked at Shen Manting's back. Then he couldn't help but sigh. It was indeed the consciousness of a little girl. Shen Luo An couldn't help but say, "Don't tease her. She's still young." Yi Qianqian replied, "Big brother, it really isn't appropriate to do it at the door." Shen Luo An was speechless. He turned around and said, "I'm going to work." "Be careful on the road, big brother." Yi Qianqian waved at him. She closed the door and skipped toward her room. Shen Zhilie was taking an afternoon nap. When he sensed Yi Qianqian enter, he didn't move. He looked up and breathed steadily. Yi Qianqian took off her shoes, lifted the covers, and crawled into bed. She reached over and hugged Shenjilia's waist. She straddled his lap and called out, "Old Shen, get up." Shenjilia didn't open his eyes. He flipped over in her position and hugged her face to face. Yi Qianqian felt a little defeated and continued, "Is it fun to dream?" Shenjilia was speechless. "More fun than me?" Shenjilia opened his eyes and asked, "Do you miss me?" Yi Qianqian's lips curled up, but before she could finish, Shenjilia pounced on her like a wolf. Yi Qianqian screamed with laughter and shouted, "Wait! I have something to say." Shenjilia pinned her under his body and held her firmly between his legs as he said, "I'm going to play with you now." "Wait a minute, I'm just kidding," Yi Qianqian exclaimed. Shenjilia kissed her on the mouth and murmured, "It's too late." "Oh." Yi Qianqian's words were completely swallowed by him. When she was feeling dizzy from the kiss, she pushed his face away and said, "Guess what I just saw?" "What?" Shenjilia was tugging at her clothes, trying his best to pull them off and throw them away. However, after a few tugs, Yi Qianqian refused to cooperate. She frowned and shouted, "Get up for a second." Yi Qianqian arched her back, and Shenjilia finally managed to pull the sweater off. "I saw Big Brother kissing Manting." Yi Qianqian wrapped her arms around his neck. "But Manting is obviously still a child. Doesn't Big Brother feel like he's molesting a child?" Shenjilia's originally serious face couldn't help but burst out laughing. He lifted the blanket up and hugged her exposed head. He pressed his lips against her neck and whispered, "What are you thinking about? Sister Manting is 2 years older than me." "Oh, you didn't see it." "Oh." Yi Qianqian's words were cut off. Chapter 2056. At first, Yi Qianqian still had the strength to deal with his fierce attacks, but then she completely fell under his passion. Slow down. Shenjilia worked very hard and didn't stop for a moment. When it was almost over, he whispered into her ear, "I want a child." Yi Qianqian narrowed her eyes and hugged him. Her eyes were wet and she whispered, "This is not a reason for you to indulge." "Get." Shenjilia laughed out loud and kissed her more passionately. Shen Manting originally wanted to ask Yi Qianqian something, but when she walked to the door, she heard faint sounds coming from inside. He didn't deliberately try to cover it up. Even though his voice was pitifully soft through the door, Shen Manting could still hear him clearly as she stood close to the door. For some reason, her hand that was about to knock on the door suddenly stopped. His cheeks began to heat up slightly, and images that made him blush immediately popped up in his mind like a conditioned reflex. She obviously hadn't seen it, but she knew it clearly. Shen Manting withdrew her hand and turned to return to her room. She picked up her phone and after studying it for a while, she finally opened the browser. She saw 2 words, "Search." She clicked on it, and a keyboard page automatically popped up. She touched it with her finger and poked a few times. She typed, "How to make your husband happy." She clicked on it, and the first line was, 10 little things to make your husband happy. After reading back and forth for a long time, Shen Manting blushed and closed the page. Shen Luo and came back very late that night. It was almost 11 p.m. When he opened the door, the room was dark. There was no doubt that the child had fallen asleep. However, when he walked in and was about to turn on the lights in the room suddenly lit up. Shen Luo and was startled. When he came back to his senses, he saw Shen Manting in her pajamas standing next to the switch. "Husband, you're back." Shen Manting went up to him. "Let me help you take off your coat." Shen Luo and was a little flattered and looked at her. Shen Manting had already reached out to touch his coat and smoothly took off his clothes. Then she hung up the coat and said, "Sit down for a while. I'll help you run the bath." Shen Luo and looked at her strangely and asked, "What's wrong?" When Shen Manting heard this, her cheeks became a little hot and she said, "I just want to help you run the bath." Then he walked in. The sound of running water came from the bathroom, and Shen Luo Anne's heart warmed slightly. Shen Manting walked in and sat beside the bathtub. She stared blankly at the clear hot water flowing down. When he heard the footsteps, he immediately stood up. Shen Luo and stared at her and walked in leisurely. What's wrong with you today? When Shen Manting heard his question, she lowered her head in embarrassment and said, Nothing, I just want to be a good wife. She looked up at him with her clear eyes and said, Hubby, from today onwards, I'm going to run the bathtub for you every day. I don't know how to make breakfast at work, but I can help you with your tie. As he spoke, the light in his eyes became even more mesmerizing. Shen Luo and stared at the cute little woman in front of him. His heart couldn't help but flutter. I still have to learn how to make love lunchboxes. Shen Manting swallowed her words. She was startled by his sudden embrace. What's wrong? Shen Luo and hugged her tightly. Shen Manting didn't know if it was an illusion, but she actually felt that he was afraid. But wasn't he a man? What would a man be afraid of? Chapter 2057. Shen Luo and hugged her tightly. Shen Manting didn't know if it was an illusion, but she felt that he was afraid. But wasn't he a man? What would a man be afraid of? Shen Manting didn't understand. She hugged the man and whispered, Honey. The room was silent. There was only the sound of the bathtub running water in the bathroom. Shen Luo and hugged her and whispered, Manting, I love you. His voice was very low, and there was an almost inaudible quiver in it. Shen Manting was slightly stunned when she heard this. She should be happy, but she didn't know why she felt a little sad. She felt that Shen Luo and was hugging her tighter. She groaned and whispered, Honey, you're too tight. I'm uncomfortable. Shen Luo and released her slightly when he heard this. Shen Manting noticed that Shen Luo and's eyes were a little red. Her heart ached and she felt a little sad. Shen Manting pouted and looked at Shen Luo. Honey, what's wrong with you today? It's nothing. Shen Luo and combed her hair behind her ear and whispered, I'm very happy. Shen Manting saw the slight smile on his lips and felt a little better. Well, as long as you're happy. I'll do this for you every day in the future. Shen Manting smiled and put her hands on his shoulders. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him. I love you too. After saying this, she felt a little sweet in her heart. With a smile on his lips, he quickly ran out. She held the door handle and looked at him deeply when she was about to close it. After a moment, she turned around and her heart was beating fast. I'm in love, Shen Manting said to herself. Her face was hot and her mood was high. Shen Luo and stood in the bathroom for a long time before he turned to look at the bathtub. The water was running fast and it was almost full. I just want to be a good wife. Her simple and shy words made Shen Luo and's heart beat faster. How nice. When he came out of the shower, Shen Manting was already asleep. He gently lifted the quilt and got into bed. Shen Luo and gently wrapped his arm around her waist. Shen Manting sensed his arrival and snuggled into his arms. She breathed heavily in his arms, relying on him and greedily. Shen Luo and smiled and quickly closed his eyes. The baby woke up early the next morning. A childish voice called out in a childish voice, Daddy! Shen Luo and woke up immediately. Shen Yuexiao was standing on the child's bed, leaning against the railing and looking at him pitifully. Shen Luo and subconsciously glanced at Shen Manting. She was still asleep, but he didn't know what she was dreaming about. There was a faint smile on her lips. Shen Luo and stood up quietly, picked up his son, and walked inside. After her son was done peeing, she helped the little boy brush his teeth, wash his face, and change his clothes. Shen Manting slowly woke up after everything was done. When he stood up, he was shocked to find that the father and son were already neatly dressed. Looking at the time, it was already 7:30. She quickly got up and said, Hubby, I woke up late. Why didn't you wake me up? Nothing much. Go back to sleep if you're tired. Shen Luo and walked over with the baby in his arms. Call me Mommy. Mommy! The little boy reached out to Shen Manting. Give me a hug. Shen Manting hugged him and said regretfully, I wanted to help you shave and tie your tie, but I can't do that today. Shen Luo and's gaze softened. He held her chin and kissed her on the lips. Chapter 2058. Shen Manting's cheeks were pink, and she shrank back. When Shenluo saw her like this, he couldn't help but lean forward and say, "I don't mind." Shen Manting's face turned even redder. "I mind." Then she glanced at Shenluo and the child and said, "I'm going to brush my teeth." After getting out of bed, Shen Manting hurried into the bathroom. She touched her face. It was burning hot. "My husband is so dirty. I didn't even brush my teeth and he kissed me just like that." Shen Manting looked at herself in the mirror and took a whiff of her breath. "This seems okay." After washing up, Shen Manting walked out and saw Shenjilia playing with a tablet with the little boy in his arms. "Do you know what this is?" Shenjilia whispered and pointed to a watermelon. "Tell me." Shen Yueshao looked at it for a long time, then pointed to it and said, "Eat." Shenjilia smiled and rubbed his head, saying, "You know it's eat. You're smart. What about this?" Xiao Yu called out. He was very excited to see Shen Manting. He struggled to get down from Shenjilia's lap and shouted, "Mommy." Shenjilia put him down and sighed, "This little boy doesn't want me now that he has a mother. Little ingrate." Little Moon ran over and hugged Shen Manting with a smile. He jumped up and down and shouted, "Mommy." Shen Manting picked up the little boy and was in a good mood. She looked at Shenjilia and asked, "Where's my husband?" Well, Shenjilia was still very unfamiliar with the way Shen Manting addressed him. He lowered his head and touched his nose, saying, "He just went out. He should be in the garden." "Okay, thank you." Shen Manting walked out with Little Moon in her arms, looking very motherly. Shenjilia looked at her back and said with a sigh, "You've really changed. Right? I wasn't wrong, right?" When Yi Qianxian came out, she heard Shenjilia's voice. She reached out and pulled him up to sit down, saying, "My father doesn't seem to be in good health recently. I called him, but he was either sleeping or coughing. I asked him what happened, but he didn't tell me. Old Shen, let's go back to Yuntown to see him." "Sure." Shenjilia looked at her. "I'll drop by Kingstown on the way to see Lily's children." Yi Qianxian gave him a look of disdain. "You never forget to take care of the children wherever you go." Shenjilia stood up and gently nudged her shoulder with his. He winked at her and said, "I like it." His feminine voice gave Yi Qianxian goosebumps. He rubbed his arms and hurriedly walked to the dining table. "Let's go tomorrow. I'm worried that Dad might get sick. You should ask for leave from the hospital." "So urgent." Shenjilia picked up his phone. "All right, let's go. Tomorrow is Saturday. Come back on Wednesday." Yi Qianxian looked at him and smiled brightly. "Okay?" How could Shenjilia refuse? With a chuckle, he replied, "All right." When Shen Manting walked out with the baby in her arms, Shenluo was indeed standing in the garden. He seemed to be pulling out weeds for an unknown plant. His movements were slow and elegant, and he looked like he was taking his time. "Daddy!" Little Moon was already one step ahead of her and shouted. He swung his legs in Shen Manting's arms. The little boy wasn't heavy, but he was still quite strong. Shen Manting couldn't carry him anymore. She loosened her grip and bent down to put him down. Chapter 2059. Shen Manting couldn't help but rub her sore hands. Shenluo saw it and stood up, patted the dust off his hands, and asked, "What's wrong?" "My hands are sore." Shen Manting rubbed her arms and glanced at Little Moon, who was squatting on the ground to pull weeds. "The little guy is quite heavy. Don't hold him for too long in the future." Shenluo patted the dust off his hands, reached out to hold her arm, and slowly rubbed it for her. "Your hand was injured, and it may be very uncomfortable if it bears heavy weights for too long." "Oh." Shen Manting bit her lip and chuckled. "I know. Let's go and take our son back for breakfast." "I want to go for a walk." Shen Manting looked at him. "Honey, take me for a walk. I haven't been around here much." In the past few days, Shenluo had driven her out. However, she had never been out of the neighborhood. Occasionally, she felt that the neighborhood was very familiar, but it was indeed very strange. Hearing Shen Manting's request, Shenluo glanced at her, and his heart was slightly moved. Take a walk in the neighborhood. If they walked in the neighborhood, they would inevitably pass by the small park and the basketball court. Enchanting's desperate hysteria on that night 2 years ago still seemed to echo in his ears. He would never forget that look for the rest of his life. In the face of her expectant and longing gaze, Shenluo and was a little afraid to look at it. Soon he looked away. He looked at his son, who was squatting on the ground and playing with weeds, and said slowly, "Let's have breakfast first. There's nothing to see around here." "Oh." Enchanting looked a little disappointed. "Then let's go in first." Shenluo and didn't dare to look at her and responded in a low voice. When it was time for breakfast, Shenjielia and Yi Qianqian were almost done. Shenjielia stood up, and before he left, he suddenly remembered something and said, "Brother, I'm going back to Yun Town with Qianqian tomorrow. Don't go to the laboratory for the next 2 days. Stay at home with the child and sister-in-law." Sister-in-law. These 2 words came out of Shenjilia's mouth, and it was indescribably pleasing to the ear. She couldn't help but glance at him and say, "Got it. You can go. You haven't been taking care of my child for long, so don't take credit here." "Hey." Shenjilia wiped the corner of his mouth and said with a look of helplessness and disdain, "You're burning the bridge after crossing the river. Before sister-in-law woke up, Qianqian, Dad, and I took care of him together. You're always running around in the laboratory, and little Yu almost doesn't recognize his father anymore." Little Moon raised his head when he heard his name being called. He looked at Shenjilia and then at Shenluo. Her little hand was holding a plastic spoon, and she was chewing on the porridge. Shenjilia looked at him and clicked his tongue. "Look at your table manners. Look at how you're eating." Little Moon ignored him and lowered his head to continue eating. "That's enough. Let's go." Shenluo and couldn't stand it anymore. "You're affecting my son's meal by standing here." Shenjilia replied, "You're heartless." He left quickly. When Shenjilia entered the room, Yi Qianqian was packing her clothes. When she saw Shenjilia come in, Yi Qianqian didn't even look up and said, "It shouldn't be too cold in Yun Town. Oh, by the way, Tong Tong is getting married next month. She wants us to go together." "No," Shenjilia said without hesitation. "What does her marriage have to do with me?" Chapter 2060. We're friends after all. Why don't we go when we get married? Yi Qianqian glanced at him. "You're a man. Why are you so petty?" "I'm not going." Shenjilia looked as if there was no room for negotiation. "But who is she married?" "Oh, her colleague in the company. He looks quite honest." "You've met him?" "I've seen his picture." Yi Qianqian folded the clothes and put them in her suitcase. "I think he's pretty good." "Tisk, that's why I say you women only know how to bully honest people." "What did honest people do?" Yi Qianqian said. "Tong Tong is also very honest. Other than her current husband, she hasn't had a boyfriend." Shenjilia didn't say anything and helped her fold the clothes. "What time is it? Aren't you going to work?" Yi Qianqian glanced at the time. "Buddy, it's 8:30. Shenjilia placed the folded clothes on the bed and leaned over. "Kiss me." Yi Qianqian replied. "No." "Kiss me." Yi Qianqian turned her head away in disgust and stuffed the folded clothes into her suitcase. Shenjilia leaned forward. "Then I'll kiss you." As he said this, he leaned over and pinched her chin. Yi Qianqian's face was straightened, and she was kissed. Yi Qianqian's face was squeezed out of shape. She turned her head away, but Shenjilia picked her up and threw her on the bed. Shenjilia pressed his body down and held her hands in place as he kissed her. Let's go." Yi Qianqian was still firmly trapped. After struggling for a while, she simply gave up. When Shenjilia was in the mood for kissing, he opened his mouth and bit her. Shenjilia didn't let go. He pulled away and said, "Are you really going to bite me?" Yi Qianqian didn't feel guilty when she saw him like this. She shouted, "Hurry up and go to work. How dare you bite me?" Shenjilia clenched his teeth. With a fierce look on his face, he rubbed his hands together and looked like a hooligan. He touched her waist and shouted, "I'm not going to work." Yi Qianqian screamed, but with a smile. "Go away, you pervert. You're committing adultery in broad daylight." So be it. Shinjilia lifted her clothes. I'm coming. Yi Qianqian hugged his head and laughed. In ancient times, you would be drowned in a pig cage. Shinjilia responded with a groan. He opened his mouth and sucked on her soft, snow-white lips. However, just as he was about to eat, he heard a clear knock on the door. Both Shinjilia and Yi Qianqian froze and turned their heads to look. The white door was ajar, and the knocking continued. Shenluo An's voice could be heard. Can you close the door a little? There are children inside. Yi Qianqian's face suddenly turned red. He kicked Shinjilia away and said, B****, how dare you not close the door? Shinjilia couldn't remember whether he had closed the door or not. After being kicked, his anger subsided a little. He straightened his clothes and got out of bed. Shenluo An stood nearby, and Shen Manting's face was already flushed. Shinjilia was a little embarrassed. He coughed lightly, and his cheeks were a little hot. He said awkwardly, I was just joking. I'm about to go to work. Shenluo An glanced at him. You could have left a long time ago. You're a bad influence on children. Chapter 2061. Shinjilia was even more embarrassed. He simply turned around and walked back without explaining. When he saw Yi Qianqian sitting there with a straight face, he coughed softly and said, I told you not to stay at home. It's so embarrassing. Yi Qianqian raised her eyebrows and asked, Who's to blame? Shinjilia said. Shinjilia finally went to work. When he went out, Shenluo An was not calm. His body, which had not been nourished for a long time, was extremely tense at this moment. In the past 3 years, he had also thought about it. But it had never been as turbulent as it was today. He tensed up and looked at Shen Manting. Shen Manting was too thin and looked like she did not have much flesh. And no way. She would hate him. Shenluo An took a long breath and walked back to the room. Shen Manting blushed a little, but when she saw him walking back to the room, she quickly followed him. Little Moon was squatting on the ground playing with a model plane, unaware of what had happened between the adults. Shen Manting called out, Hubby. Shenluo An was very anxious, and when he saw her follow him in, he became even more restless. The anger that he had not felt for a long time surged, and the desire that had been suppressed for a long time was once again easily aroused. However, when he saw her innocent expression, he could only forcibly suppress his anger. He forced himself to calm down and looked at her, asking, What's wrong? I think Jilia and Qianqian are very happy. They look so happy every day. Shen Manting looked at him with a pair of sparkling eyes. She looked at him and said, I think they are like a real husband and wife. When Shenluo An heard this, he seemed to have read between the lines. He glanced at her and asked, What do you think about us? Shen Manting looked at him and said softly, I don't think we are as husband and wife as they are. I always feel that something is missing. As she spoke, Shen Manting stepped forward and said, That's why I think I want to be a good wife, but I still feel that something is missing. As she spoke, Shen Manting took another step forward. Shenluo An hurriedly took a step back and looked at her. His body was even more tense. Shen Manting's fair face was flushed as if she had applied rouge. She looked particularly charming. Her appearance was so cute that it made people want to directly crush her. His Adam's apple tightened. He averted his eyes and said, Don't let your imagination run wild. We're fine. No, I think there's something missing. Shen Manting was usually quite obedient, but for some reason, she seemed very stubborn today. I think you know what it is, don't you? Shen Manting took a step closer. Hubby, you must know why. If Jilia and Qianqian can play like that, why don't you play with me? Shenluo An stepped back, not daring to look at her. He walked to the door and said, We're not children anymore. There's nothing fun here. Jilia and sister-in-law are still children at heart. We've grown up and are adults. We can't be compared to them. Shenluo An noticed that her eyes had turned red. Shen Manting looked as if something extremely heartbreaking had happened to her, and soon, big drops of tears fell from her eyes. Jilia likes Qianqian, so he plays with her. You don't play with me because you don't like me, right? Shen Manting sobbed. You don't like me at all, do you? Her simple and innocent words silenced Shen Luo. After reading it, you can go and read the new book. It's also free. The cute, handsome, and tough male lead, Big Lock. You won't be disappointed after reading it. It's so good. Chapter 2062. How could he not like her? It was precisely because he liked her so much that he was worried about her gains and losses. It was precisely because he loved her so much that he was afraid. Shen Luo, Anne's chest ached, and the burning desire in his body subsided a little. The door of the room was open. Nanny he heard the movement inside and came over to take a look. She was a little worried. But soon she turned around and carried the child. Shen Luo, and clearly sensed the movement behind him. He looked at Shen Manting in front of him and sighed softly. He walked up to her and gently held her in his arms. Shen Manting sniffled, raised her hand to wipe her face, and hugged Shen Luo in tightly. Manting! Shen Luo, Anne's voice sounded a little drawn out, with a soft sigh. When Shen Manting heard his voice and felt the clear warmth in front of her, her tears stopped. She buried her cheek in his arms and answered in a nasal voice, "Hubby." It was a greeting in 2 words. Shen Luo, and had heard it for several days, but he was still not used to it. He was very happy to hear such an affectionate greeting, which he had longed for a long time, come out of her mouth. Shen Luo, and was a little greedy as he gently kissed her hair. Shen Manting was tickled by his kiss. It was a little comfortable but also a little uncomfortable. She couldn't describe the feeling and subconsciously avoided it. Shen Luo, and quickly released her and said softly, "I'm a little busy today. I have to go to the laboratory. You and the baby should be good at home." Shen Manting couldn't describe the feeling in her heart. It was a little sour and a little sad. However, his explanation made her feel a little less angry. Shen Manting nodded and put her hands on his shoulders. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him gently on the lips. She said softly, "Come back soon." Shen Luo, and was moved, and his heart was even more shaken. He looked at her deeply and only said one word, "Okay." Shen Manting looked into his eyes and felt that there seemed to be endless information in them. She couldn't understand it, but she could tell that he didn't dislike her. He liked her. Realizing this, Shen Manting smiled through her tears. She glanced at his clothes and said, "Hubby, I learned how to tie a tie yesterday. Shall I tie a tie for you?" Shen Luo, and was a little surprised. "Who did you learn it from?" "There's a TV on the phone. I learned from the TV on the phone." As Shen Manting spoke, she walked inside and found a man's tie that had been left and used in the cloakroom for a long time. The light red and dark red checkered tie looked very exquisite and formal. Shen Luo, and was wearing very simple clothes. He didn't usually need to wear such formal clothes when he went to the laboratory. But when he saw her pick up her tie, he couldn't help but look forward to it. Looking at her expectant smile and her sparkling big eyes, he couldn't help but smile. He stroked her head and said, "Then I'll go change my clothes." Shen Luo, and walked into the cloakroom. As soon as he took off his coat, he saw Shen Manting looking at him with a burning gaze. The fire that had just calmed down was once again easily ignited by her at this moment. His throat tightened, and he closed the door uneasily. When he came out, he had already changed into a formal suit. Chapter 2063. Am I handsome? Shen Luo, and glanced at his attire and smiled. It's not easy to hear a compliment from you. Shen Manting's eyes sparkled. She tightened her tie and said, "If you like it, I'll praise you every day." As he spoke, he hopped forward and said, "I'll help you with your tie." She was in high spirits. She stood on her tiptoes and put the tie around his neck. Shen Luo, and had never experienced such a feeling. This feeling of being treasured by her, desired by her, fawned over by her. His heart was filled with warmth as he stared at her fixedly with a pair of eyes. Shen Manting's face was flushed as she concentrated on helping him tie his tie. Like this, Shen Manting muttered to herself as she twirled the tie around, but it didn't seem right no matter how hard she tried. How can it be wrong? That's exactly what the TV said. She scratched her head, but when she looked up, she saw that Shenluo and was looking at her. She didn't know when it started, but that gaze seemed to want to need her deeply. Shen Manting blushed and said, "I forgot how to do it." "It's okay." Shenluo and looked at her. "Take your time." Shen Manting nodded and continued to work. However, his unwavering determination just now had been defeated. Shen Manting felt her face getting hotter and hotter, and her movements became slower and slower. In the end, she couldn't take it anymore. She stomped her feet and said, "Aya, don't keep looking at me. I was so nervous that I didn't know what to do." Shenluo and chuckled and looked away. "Then I won't look at you." Shen Manting didn't believe him and quietly lifted her eyes to peek at him. She realized that Shenluo and was really not looking at her anymore. It was as if he did not care at all. This feeling made Shen Manting even more unhappy. He flung his necktie and said, "Forget it, I can't handle it." Shenluo and couldn't help but laugh. His heart was surrounded by a thick and sweet feeling. Looking at her little face, which was full of excitement just a moment ago, suddenly looking like a frosted eggplant, he actually felt very satisfied. He couldn't help but hug her. His actions were a little sudden. Shen Manting was shocked and froze. She looked at the frightened expression on his face. "Manting." Shenluo and embraced her and called out softly, "Manting, Manting." Shen Manting looked at him timidly and shrank back. She was a little uncertain and asked, "Hubby, are you stupid?" The smile on Shenluo An's face widened. He pinched her chin with his palm and swallowed her sweetness. Shen Manting only felt that it was a little sudden, but very quickly, her body seemed to have turned into a pool of spring water, indescribably soft. Shenluo and gradually moved deeper and deeper, sweeping her out to be with him. His kiss, very deep, very heavy. It was deeper and more dizzying than the last time. Shen Manting's hands unconsciously climbed onto his shoulders, and her whole body seemed to have lost all its strength as she hung onto his body. His body was getting closer and closer. Shen Manting could clearly feel his desire and passion. Between her waist and abdomen, a burning hot unknown object was pressing against her. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling that made her a little uncomfortable. Shen Manting was a little curious. She put her hand down and touched it tentatively. In an instant, Shenluo An's entire body tensed up. Chapter 2064. Shenluo An's eyes were as deep as the sea, dark and bottomless. Shen Manting vaguely felt a sense of danger, and the sense of danger made her look forward to it. Shenluo An's tender hands were still resting on the bed, and he was so stiff that he was close to going crazy. "Manting." Shenluo An's voice was low and husky. He pressed against her, and the deep desire in his voice moved her. "Honey." Shen Manting suddenly felt a little scared, and she only felt that her palms were getting hotter and hotter. She quickly withdrew her hands, but she heard Shenluo An say in a low voice, "Don't move." Shen Manting was shocked, and she didn't dare to move. At the same time, she looked at him in confusion and asked timidly, "What?" When Shenluo An saw her like this, he immediately felt an inexplicable sense of guilt. His originally tense body became more and more uncomfortable. Shenluo An closed his eyes, put her down and said hoarsely, "Nothing." When Shen Manting saw that he was about to leave, she felt a little empty in her heart. She held his hand and said, "Honey." Shenluo An was even more angry, and he suppressed the most primitive desire in his heart and looked at her. The lights in the cloakroom were not turned on. Compared to the outside, the light inside was very dim. Shen Manting's eyes seemed to be shining, and she looked at him, pulled his hand and said, "You just kissed me so happily." Boom. Her words were like the blazing sun that was shot out of the darkness. In an instant, the light around them suddenly burst, and Shenluo An was even more unable to control himself. He held her hand and pulled her into his arms. Even Shenluo An himself didn't know what he was going to do. It was completely a subconscious action, and when he came to himself, Shenmanting was already in his arms. Shenmanting looked up at Shenluo. Her pair of big eyes were full of doubt. Looking at Shenluo, and she said softly, "Honey, you look so different today." Shenluo's throat was even more tight, and he asked hoarsely, "What's different? What's different?" Shenmanting couldn't say it, and facing Shenluo's burning gaze, her cheeks became even hotter, and she said, "It's different. Everything is different." But when he looked down, he saw the protruding bulge. She couldn't help but reach out and poke him. Shenluo, who was above her, immediately drew in a sharp breath. "Don't move." Shenluo's voice was low and hoarse. He seemed to be enduring it. "Don't move." Shenmanting was a little shocked. She quickly withdrew her hand and asked, "Dear, are you feeling unwell? Uncomfortable?" How could he be comfortable when he was already like this? Shenluo blushed and pressed her hand down. Shenmanting only felt a burning sensation on her skin. She looked up at him in confusion. "If I'm not feeling well, can you help me?" "Of course." Shenmanting looked at him. "I'll go get the medicine from Nanny He." As he spoke, he struggled to get up. But before she could move, Shenluo pulled her back. "You're my medicine." Shenmanting was stunned and looked at him. Then she said with some fear, "Hubby, are you going to eat me?" Shenluo's expression deepened. "Can I?" His voice was low and hoarse, and he asked with desire. Shenmanting looked at him and shrank back. She said, "I heard that eating human flesh is not good for the body, and it's sour." Chapter 2065. She shrunk back and forth in Shenluo's arms. Shenluo couldn't help laughing when he saw her cute and scared look. "What if I have to eat you?" Shenluo looked at her, pressed her against the door, and rubbed her gently. "I won't feel uncomfortable after eating you." Shenmanting was slightly stunned, and her whole body was hot. She blushed even more, looked away, and said nervously and fearfully, "It will feel better after eating me, then you eat me." As she said that, she rolled up her sleeves with trembling hands and stretched out her white and tender hands in front of Shenluo. "Bite me. I'm still alive. Remember to send me to the hospital?" Although she said that, Shenmanting's eyes were already red. She looked at him with a pleading look. Obviously, she was very scared. Shenluo laughed even louder, lifted her up, and lifted her clothes with his palm. "Hubby." Shenmanting was a little scared and wanted to hold him down, but she couldn't stop him at all. Shenluo's hand had already reached into her clothes and pinched her lovely white and tender hands. A strange feeling arose from that place. Shenmanting couldn't help but scream, "Hubby!" Shenluo didn't make a sound, and he lowered his head to take all her words into his mouth. He gently licked and kissed her, and heavily teased her. Shenmanting couldn't help but breathe heavily because of his familiar movements. Hearing her voice, Shenluo couldn't help but lower his head and bite her white and erect breasts. He ravaged and sucked, and Shenmanting felt like she was bitten by ants all over, and it was extremely uncomfortable. She couldn't help but make a strange sound, but it was just a sound, and Shenmanting quickly covered her mouth. But her body was still being teased, and the strange and turbulent feeling crushed what little was left of her rationality. She couldn't help but squint her eyes and hold his head with both hands. She clasped her legs around his, and even her toes curled up. She felt uncomfortable all over, but it seemed quite comfortable, Daddy. A childish voice suddenly broke in. The world that had been surging with dark waves was like a mirror that had been shattered by a single punch. Shenluo's movements immediately froze, and Shenmanting breathed a sigh of relief. When Shenmanting realized that she had been put down, she hurriedly tugged at her clothes. His face had already turned red, and his body was burning hot. Shenmanting stumbled out of the room in a hurry. When she saw her son enter the room, she picked up the infant and sat on the bed. His heart was still beating fast, and he could not help but look at the cloakroom. Shenluo walked out from inside. His clothes were disheveled, and the tie around his neck was crooked. Shen Manting couldn't help but take a second look at his tall figure. Shen Luo, and didn't linger and quickly entered the bathroom. She heard the sound of water splashing, and she found it a little strange. Bathing at this time? Aren't you going to work? Just as he was feeling puzzled, Nanny he entered the room. The moment Nanny he saw Shen Manting's swollen lips and messy clothes, as well as the sound of running water in the bathroom, she knew what had happened. She hurried forward and held the little boy's hand. Let's go. Grandma made you something to eat. I'll feed you, Nanny he said. Xiao Yu pouted unhappily and turned around to hug Shen Manting. I don't want to eat, Mommy. Chapter 2066. She stood up with the baby in her arms and said, I'll go feed him. What did you make? Her cheeks were a little red, and she looked very shy. Nanny he looked at her with an ambiguous expression and said, I made some colorful noodles with vegetable powder. It's very nutritious. Shen Manting walked out, and Yi Qianqian walked out at the same time. Qianqian. Shen Manting looked at Yi Qianqian and said, You're out. Yi Qianqian blinked. She felt a little uncomfortable being called that. Especially when she thought of what had happened just now, she felt even more embarrassed. Yi Qianqian nodded and forced herself to calm down. What's wrong? Nothing. Shen Manting was a little hesitant, but she quickly said, Are you going out later? No. Yi Qianqian felt that she wanted to say something but stopped. Do you have something to say? Well, I have something to ask you. Let's go out for a walk later. Shen Manting smiled. I have a lot to ask you. Okay. Yi Qianqian agreed. Looking at her expectant look, she felt a little strange. Call me later. Okay. Shen Manting sat on the sofa and fed the baby. Little Moon ate happily while twisting the little toy in his hand. He suddenly looked up and mumbled with his mouth full, Daddy. Shen Luo, and was still in the same outfit, but he didn't wear his tie. When he heard the little boy shout, he went forward and rubbed his head. He said to someone, I'm going to work. Wait for me to come back. He was looking at the little boy, but Shen Manting knew that he was talking to her. She nodded and replied softly, Okay. Shen Luo, and left quickly. Shen Manting stared at his back, her heart filled with satisfaction. She felt even more embarrassed when she thought of Shen Luo and's intimate actions just now. She also felt strange in her body. It was very strange. Shen Manting didn't know what this feeling was, but it seemed that she liked it. Shen Luo, and left quickly. Shen Manting was a little absent-minded as she fed the baby. Nanny he noticed and said, If you have something to do, go ahead. I'll feed the baby. There's no need for that. Nanny you can go about your business. I'll do it. Shen Manting insisted. After feeding the baby, she took him to play in the garden. Looking at little Moon bouncing up and down, Shen Manting felt the happiness of a mother. That's great. Yi Qianqian's voice came from behind. In the blink of an eye, the child has grown up so much. Yi Qianqian looked at the little boy and turned to look at Shen Manting. I really envy you. Why are you envious of me? Shen Manting looked at her in confusion. I'm envious of you. I think you're pretty and sensible. Jilia seems to like you very much. Yi Qianqian couldn't help but take another look at her and said, You've indeed changed. Manting, it's better for you to stay like this. Is that so? Shen Manting was a little embarrassed. My husband seems to think so too. Did he say anything to you? Shen Manting shook her head. He didn't say anything, but I could feel that he was thinking the same thing. Chapter 2067. Yi Qianqian thought about it and explained, Actually, it's not that I don't like you. I just like the way you are right now. You look happy every day. You don't remember anything, so you don't feel any pain. It's pretty good. Was it painful for me before? Shen Manting was a little puzzled. I feel like I'm the one who's in pain now that I don't know anything. Hubby always calls me Manting, 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 but I don't feel happy at all. I feel so sad. After all, she was a 12-year-old girl and didn't know how to hide her emotions at all. Yi Qianqian looked at her pouting face and turned her head away. She seemed to be sighing with emotion as she said meaningfully, "He loves you." "I know," Shenmanting replied with a smile on her face. However, within a few seconds, her smile disappeared and she said, "But he won't play with me." Yi Qianqian was speechless. Looking at Shenmanting's angry face, she didn't seem to be joking. It was at that moment that Yi Qianqian once again realized that this was a 12-year-old girl. Yi Qianqian thought for a moment and explained, "Perhaps Big Brother is busy." She glanced at Shenmanting's expression and deliberated over her choice of words before saying, "Moreover, he's more mature and steady. I don't think he'll play much." The more Yi Qianqian thought about it, the more convinced she became. She finally made up her mind and nodded her head. "He's always been so serious. Don't mind him too much." "But why can Jilia play with you?" Shenmanting was puzzled. Yi Qianqian was surprised. "You had so much fun this morning." Shenmanting looked at him enviously and said, "My husband never plays with me. I want to play too." Yi Qianqian was speechless. She thought Shenmanting was talking about the game of eagle catches chicks, or hide and seek. Hearing this, he coughed lightly and said, "Well, what we did this morning can't be considered as playing." Shenmanting was a little confused. "But you're smiling so happily. Aren't you playing?" Yi Qianqian felt a little embarrassed and replied, "Well, not really. Besides, I'm not that happy either." Shenmanting was very certain. "You're so happy." Yi Qianqian replied, "Well, be happy then." "You're still trying to deceive me." Shenmanting looked as if she had already seen through him. Yi Qianqian felt even more embarrassed. When she saw Yi Qianqian's expression, she explained in all seriousness, "I didn't. We weren't actually playing. To be exact, we were flirting." Shenmanting's eyes widened when she heard that word. Flirt? She looked as if Yi Qianqian had said something unbelievable. Yi Qianqian suddenly felt guilty for lying to a little girl. When she saw the expression on Yi Qianqian's face, she turned her head away and said, "Yeah, we're husband and wife. It's normal for us to flirt and play around. Then why doesn't my husband flirt with me?" Yi Qianqian replied, "I can't answer your question." But Shenmanting was puzzled. Yi Qianqian was silent for a moment before she said, "How about this? When Big Brother comes home at night, you can ask him. You can say, 'Honey, why aren't you flirting with me? Look at the people next door, they're all flirting.'" Chapter 2068. Yi Qianqian said, "That's not the point. The point is that you have to ask him. You shouldn't be asking me this kind of question." Okay. Shenmanting nodded quickly. "I understand. I'll ask him tonight why he didn't flirt with me." Yi Qianqian finally raised her head in relief and said, "Very good, but don't tell him that I taught you. It'll be troublesome if you say that I'm a bad influence on a child." Shenmanting looked at her with a smile and said, "You're the child. I'm taller than you. You're more like a child than me." Yi Qianqian was a little confused. She sighed softly and said, "I shouldn't have told you so much." She seemed to have been a bad influence on her. Shenmanting's temperament, the way she spoke, and the expression in her eyes didn't seem like that of a normal adult. Although she was not mentally retarded, Yi Qianqian could no longer treat her as a peer. Shenmanting looked at her and asked, "How long have you been married to Jilia?" 2 years. Yi Qianqian glanced at little Moon, who was playing with the grass on the ground. "I got married to old Shen the year Big Brother brought him back." "Then, when did my husband and I get married?" Shenmanting looked at her and said, "I think it's been a long time, but it doesn't seem that long." Shenmanting suddenly felt a little childish when she said that. She coughed and said with a straight face, "That's right. I'm just curious. You're married and you have a ring on your finger." Shenmanting glanced at Yi Qianqian's hand. On the ring finger of her left hand, there was a very shiny and beautiful diamond ring. After a moment, she looked at her somewhat thin hand. Her skin was a little yellow, and it didn't look as good as Yi Qianqian's hand at all. "And I don't have a ring on my finger." Yi Qianqian subconsciously hid her hand when she heard that. Her eyes were a little evasive. She looked into the distance and suddenly felt a little guilty. "Why didn't I think of that? Why didn't I have a ring? Because Shen Manting and Shen Luo, and were not married at all. Shen Manting was not willing to wear Shen Luo and's ring at all. However, even though she knew that, how could she bring it up to Shen Manting? It was difficult to speak at all. He glanced at Shen Manting, coughed softly, and said, maybe it's because you've slept for too long. Look at your hand. It's so skinny. How can you wear a ring? Sit. Shen Manting felt inexplicably happy when she heard his answer. That's what I thought too. Actually, I saw a ring in the shape of a heart with many diamonds. It was placed under the blanket, but it was too big for me, so I put it back. Shen Manting spoke with a hint of boastfulness in her voice. It's very beautiful. As Yi Qianqian watched, she found it amusing and sad at the same time. She nodded her head and reached out to hold Yi Qianqian's hand. In a soft voice, she said, it's good that you like him. Big brother actually likes you very much. He loves you very much. As long as you believe in him with all your heart, he won't let you down. Shen Manting felt a little puzzled and didn't quite understand what she meant. She nodded and said, yes, I know he loves me very much. I can feel it. No one has ever treated me like this before. I love him very much too. Yes, I know he loves me very much. I can feel it. No one has ever treated me like this before. Chapter 2069. Huh. Yi Qianqian's eyes widened and she was a little confused. What did you just say? Shen Manting thought that she hadn't made herself clear, so she repeated, can you teach me how to seduce men? Yi Qianqian wanted to laugh, but when she saw Shen Manting's serious expression, she couldn't laugh. She coughed lightly. Actually, I don't know how to do that. As long as a man likes you, you don't have to seduce him. He will come over himself. If he doesn't like you, no matter how you seduce him, it's useless. These words were the truth of the world. When Yi Qianqian said this, she saw that Shen Manting had a look of understanding on her face. Then, do I still have to seduce my husband? Shen Manting looked a little defeated. I think my husband likes me, but sometimes I feel that he doesn't like me that much. Yesterday, I used my phone to check it out and tried to imitate what's written on it, but I realized that it didn't work. What things? Prepare the bathwater for my husband, shave, tie his tie, and give him a good morning kiss. Wow, Yi Qianqian was a little surprised. You did all that? A little, tisk tisk. Yi Qianqian laughed even more. She didn't know how she felt, but she said, I've never done those things that you mentioned. Moreover, Shenjilia had always been the one who prepared the bathwater for her. In all fairness, Shenjilia was really good to her. Although he had been a little demanding in some aspects recently, at least he was wholeheartedly devoted to her. Shen Manting felt a little embarrassed, and her cheeks turned slightly red. She said, oh, it's my first time being someone else's wife. I don't know what to do. As she said this, she pouted and said, Qianqian, teach me what I should do. Otherwise, I don't know what to do to be a wife. It's very simple. You just have to take care of the child. Yi Qianqian shrugged. The child is still young. You have to take care of the child and let him worry less. That's a good wife. Oh. Shen Manting nodded and couldn't help but ask curiously, since you don't have children, what do you usually do when you have nothing to do? Yi Qianqian replied. Give birth. Shen Manting looked at her belly and asked, are you going to have a baby? Yi Qianqian rubbed her belly and smiled bitterly. I'll give birth once I'm pregnant. The key was that she couldn't get pregnant. In the past 2 years, they had not taken any safety measures. She just couldn't get pregnant. This year, she was already 28 years old. If she delayed any longer, she might become an elderly pregnant woman. Moreover, if Grandma and Uncle Blind were right, this year, it was very likely that she could get pregnant. She looked at Little Moon, who was having a great time playing by himself. She felt a twinge of jealousy in her heart and said longingly, that's why I'm so envious of you. You don't know anything when you wake up. You've forgotten all the unhappy things. You even have a cute baby and a man who loves you. Ah. Shen Manting sensed that she seemed to be a little sad, so she cautiously said, you have it too. You have to continue living happily. When Yi Qianqian saw the look on her face, a bright smile appeared on her face and she nodded her head. Yeah. Shinjilia came home very early that day, and he seemed to be in a good mood. Chapter 2070. Little Moon looked at him and gave him a peck on the cheek. Shinjilia smiled and asked, "Where's your aunt?" The little guy's eyes were big, black, and bright. He pointed to the room and said, "Sin Senior, Auntie, lift your tongue." Shinjilia pinched his cheek. "Tell me, Auntie." Little Moon grinned and wiggled his little body excitedly. "Uncle." "Humph, little rascal," Shinjilia said as he placed him on the sofa. He looked up and saw Enchanting walking out of the kitchen with a plate of fruit in her hand. "Sister-in-law, Qianqian and I are going back to Yun Town for a while." "Well, Yun Town is Qianqian's hometown, right?" She gave him a watermelon. "Qianqian told me about it." "Go ahead. I'll go in first then." Shinjilia took a bite of the watermelon, then stood up and pushed the door open. Yi Qianqian was sleeping. When she heard Shinjilia's voice, she covered her head with the blanket and shouted, "Don't be noisy." Shinjilia took off his shoes and leaned over. He pulled down the blanket and teased, "You're sleeping so early? Were you tired last night? You still have the nerve to say that?" Yi Qianqian lifted the blanket and said angrily, "I haven't been feeling well for the past few days, and you deliberately messed with me." "How did I do that?" Shinjilia looked aggrieved. He leaned over and whispered, "Aren't I working hard for our future happiness?" Scram. Shinjilia laughed out loud and tugged at her. "Let's go. If we rush back to Yun Town now, we can still take Dad out for dinner. I've already told him." "What time is it?" "It's 4 o'clock. The plane leaves at 5:30. Yi Qianqian immediately stood up and said, "Wait for me." By the time Yi Qianqian finished washing up, more than 10 minutes had passed. Shinjilia had it simple. He pulled his suitcase up and went to the door to wait for her. On his way out, Shinjilia noticed that Enchanting seemed to be glancing at him a few times. She couldn't help but ask, "Sister-in-law, do you need something from me?" Enchanting shook her head and said, "No." "Oh." Shinjilia looked away, but after a while, he felt that she was looking at him again. Enchanting looked up and immediately averted her eyes. Shinjilia found it a little strange, but soon Yi Qianqian came out. As the couple walked out of the house, Shinjilia whispered, "Why do I feel that Sister Manting is acting a little strange today?" Yi Qianqian was shocked, but she quickly pretended to be calm and asked, "How so?" "That's right. I think she's peeking at me." Shinjilia felt goosebumps all over his body. "She's only 12 years old at the moment. Don't tell me she fell in love with me because I'm handsome? Go away." Yi Qianqian shot him a look of disdain. "How can you be so shameless? I think she might want to ask you something." "What is it?" "Ahem, she kept pestering me with questions for the whole day, so I just gave her a CD." Shinjilia had a bad feeling about this. "The disc? It's the one you brought back last time?" Yi Qianqian was a little embarrassed and ran forward. Shinjilia was dumbfounded. He quickly chased after her and shouted, "Are you crazy? Big Brother is going to kill me." Chapter 2071. Shinjilia was actually convinced by her fallacious reasoning. But he still felt strange in his heart, so he followed her and said, "Wait for me." Enchanting took care of the child while he ate and bathed. She finally managed to coax him to sleep before she went to wash up. When she came out, it was already past 8 o'clock, but Shenluo and still hadn't returned. Enchanting was a little bored, so she took out the thing that Yi Qianqian had given her in the afternoon. It was a small, round box with a CD inside. The CD was two-sided and had no pictures. She followed the method that Yi Qianqian had taught her in the afternoon. She first locked the door, then turned on the computer in the room, and then inserted the CD into it. Her fingers touched the touch panel a few times, and after clicking the mouse, an image appeared. A drunken man, wearing a suit, stumbled back home. Soon, a woman who looked very conservatively opened the door and carried him in. She spoke in a strange language that Enchanting couldn't understand at all. After watching for a while, Enchanting finally understood. The husband was probably drunk. When he returned home, the wife brought a basin of water, wrung out a towel, and wiped the husband's face and hands. She also took off the husband's suit and then took off his shoes. Enchanting secretly noted it down and thought to herself, "The next time my husband comes home drunk, I'll take care of him like this." But in the TV, the husband was sleeping on the sofa, so when the time came, she would directly carry her husband to the big bed. But as she continued to watch, something didn't seem right. The wife began to cry, and as she cried, the husband seemed to become impatient and kicked his wife. Enchanting saw it and felt a little angry. That's so annoying. How dare he hit his wife? But then she saw the wife stand up and walk away. Well done. Enchanting was angry, and then she applauded her wife. But then, the husband seemed to have a look of regret on his face. He stood up and staggered back to the room with his wife. Back in the room, the wife sat on the bed and cried bitterly. When she saw her husband come in, she stopped crying and didn't dare to move. The husband went forward, pinched his wife's chin, and kissed her. Enchanting's eyes widened, and she couldn't believe what she saw. Weren't they just arguing? What was even more unbelievable was that the woman did not resist and hugged the man. After kissing for a few minutes, they began to undress. Enchanting was actually a little excited. She hugged her legs and sat on the bed with great interest. Soon, the husband's shirt was taken off, and the wife was only left with a white bra. Her husband pushed the bra up and bit her. Enchanting subconsciously covered her small chest. She was suddenly reminded of what Shenluo and had done to her in the morning. Then, he heard an ambiguous voice coming from the woman's mouth. Enchanting covered her mouth, and her cheeks turned red. It was the same feeling she had in the morning. She felt a little uncomfortable, and as she watched, she felt more and more uncomfortable. As the scene on the television became more and more intense, the wife placed her palm on the place where her husband peed. It was so big. It was completely different from Little Moon's. Enchanting suddenly realized that the spot she had poked several times in the morning. Wasn't that the spot? Heavens! Chapter 2072. Then, his wife ate the thing in one bite. Enchanting was a little shocked and watched with her eyes wide open. However, she didn't expect that the man not only didn't seem to be in pain, but also enjoyed it. The man's voice was extremely embarrassing. Enchanting couldn't help but rub her legs. When she was about to continue watching, she suddenly heard the sound of the door opening. Perhaps the door couldn't be opened, so someone knocked on it from outside. Enchanting quickly closed the computer, got out of bed, and opened the door. Shenluo and looked a little tired. When he saw her, he smiled slightly. He reached out to touch her head and said, "Why did you lock the door all of a sudden?" Enchanting felt even more uncomfortable. She looked away guiltily and said, "Why did you come back so late?" "It's only 9 o'clock. It's not late." Shenluo and walked in and closed the door. "I'll come back early tomorrow." However, when the light in the room was turned on, he could clearly see her face. He reached out to touch it, and it was indeed a little hot. Shenluo and frowned and had a bad feeling. "What's wrong with you? Why is your face so red?" Enchanting lowered her head and quickly took his hand away. She mumbled, "Well, I'll go run the bathwater for you." After that, she quickly turned around and went to the bathroom. Enchanting turned on the faucet and heard the sound of running water. She finally breathed a sigh of relief. When she thought of the image on the computer, she felt even more ashamed. It was too perverted. How could Yi Qianxian show her such a thing? "Qianxian, I don't think the 10 little things on the internet are very useful. Do you have any way to make my husband like me more?" "Well, there is, but it's not very suitable for you." "But I can do it. It's not convenient for me to say, but if you are interested, I can give you a CD. You can watch it whenever you want, but you must watch it at night. Don't watch it during the day. When you watch it, lock the door and wait for your husband to come back. He will like you." "Really? Really, you can try it." "Well, thank you so much, Qianxian." She thought it would be similar to the 10 little things, but she didn't expect it to be Shen Manting's mind was buzzing, but suddenly she remembered. It seems the computer is still on the bed. She immediately stood up and jogged out of the room. The sound of water was getting softer and softer, but at the same time, another sound was getting louder and louder. Shen Manting's body tensed up, and she immediately heard the man's panting. "Don't look." Shen Manting hurried forward, covered the laptop, and hid it behind her. His face was already as red as an apple. "I didn't know it was such a thing." Shen Manting stammered. "Someone gave it to me." "Who gave it to you?" Shen Luo, and walked over and stood in front of her. He looked at her with a burning gaze. Shen Manting felt an itch in her heart. She looked at him and said, "Qian gave it to me." "Why did she give you this?" he said. Shen Manting was extremely embarrassed. "I asked her how I could make you like me more. She told me to lock the door and watch this so that you would like me more, so I watched it," Shen Manting said. Chapter 2073. Shen Luo's eyes darkened. He took the computer from her hand and said, "She didn't mean to let you watch it secretly." What? Shen Manting couldn't react for a moment. "Go inside and turn off the water." Shen Luo turned on the computer again. Shen Manting seemed to know what he meant. She was a little embarrassed and lowered her head, saying, "This is not good." "Go ahead." Shen Luo rubbed her head and said, "Come back after you're done." Shen Manting was very obedient. She obediently went to the bathroom and turned off the water. "Turn off the lights too." When she walked out, she heard Shen Luo say this. At that moment, Shen Luo was sitting in bed with the computer on the quilt. A pair of amber eyes were staring at her. It was very deep, very thick, and very dangerous. Shen Manting was a little scared. She shrank and said, "Honey, come here." Shen Luo waved at her and said, "Come here." Shen Manting bit the bullet and turned off the lights. She took off her slippers and went to bed. Shen Luo clicked a few times on the computer, and then a different picture was played. "Have you seen this movie?" Shen Luo hugged her. "This movie is much better than the one you just watched." Shen Manting looked at the picture that popped up on the computer screen. There were 4 words on it: "Gone with the Wind." For some reason, Shen Manting felt a little disappointed. But she still focused on watching it. The more she watched, the more familiar she felt. She said, "Honey, I've seen this movie." Shen Luo answered lightly. "This was your favorite movie. Do you remember what it was about?" Shen Manting only felt that it was familiar, but she couldn't remember what it was about. "I forgot, but I'm sure I've seen it." "I haven't seen it yet. Watch it with me." Shen Luo hugged her in his arms and whispered, "Let me see what your favorite movie is like." Shen Manting continued to watch. When she saw that the female lead agreed to marry a little boy for Ashley, she felt a little sad and said, "Will she really marry this person? It's so silly. It's not worth it at all." Shen Luo hugged her and gently kissed her hair. Yes, it's not worth it. But hadn't Shen Manting done the same thing before? However, Sea Jelly was trying to make Shen Manting stay, while Shen Manting was trying to escape. Shen Manting was very serious. Later, when she saw Scarlet starving and freezing, she felt sympathy for her. When he stole his sister's boyfriend for the sake of money, he felt very angry. But what moved Shen Manting the most was the lines that the male lead, Rhett, said when he asked the female lead to marry him. "You're marrying either an old man or a child. Why don't you try a real man like me?" Shen Manting was a little excited when she read this and said, "It's so romantic. How can Rhett be so handsome?" Shen Luo smiled and held her hand from under the blanket. He said in a low voice, "Marry me." His voice was low, and there was a hint of solicitation in it. Shen Manting thought that he was analyzing the plot of the movie, so she happily kissed him on the cheek and said, after that, they got married. Scarlet married Rhett and gave birth to a child named Bonnie Bai. After she finished speaking, she suddenly came back to her senses and asked, "How did I know?" "Because you've seen it before." Shen Luo pressed her down. "There are some things that you still remember subconsciously. This is my favorite movie, second to none. Chapter 2074. Because you've seen it. Shin Luo pressed her down. There are some things that you still remember subconsciously. Shen Manting was startled by his sudden movement and blinked her eyes. Then do you still remember whether you love me? Shin Luo stared at her with burning eyes. Follow the truest answer in your heart. Tell me, do you love me? The sound of the movie came to her ears. Through the light on the screen, Shen Manting could clearly see Shin Luo's expression. He was very serious. Shen Manting was in a trance for a moment. She stared at him blankly. Her heartbeat was very clear and dreamy. Seeing Shin Luo, like this, Shen Manting's heart sank slightly. Her eyes became very clear. She couldn't control a thought that was about to come out. Love. After a long time, Shen Manting answered. There was only Shin Luo's face in her eyes. Shen Manting said seriously, love. Shin Luo's eyes were a little red. He slowly tightened his hold on her and said, say it again. Honey, I love you. Shen Manting was very serious and said word by word, I love you. I really love you. Shen Manting didn't know why when she said these words, her heart ached faintly. But there was unprecedented satisfaction. Shen Manting hugged him back and looked at the computer screen. She saw Rhett holding sea jelly and throwing her on the bed to consummate their marriage. Shen Manting was moved. She raised her face and kissed his lips. With shyness, she raised her face and kissed him. Shin Luo's heart softened when she kissed him. In a moment, he became the host and held her firmly in his arms. He went deep and pressed her down on the bed. His arms firmly wrapped around her waist. Shin Luo's kiss became more and more passionate. Shen Manting suddenly felt that he was different again. He seemed to have changed his attitude from this morning. At that time, he seemed to be patient and restrained. But now, Shen Manting could easily feel that he was ready to attack. Thinking of the scene she just saw on the computer screen, she blushed even more. She subconsciously struggled, but Shin Luo seemed to be sure of something. Not only did he not let go, but he also held her hand. Their fingers were interlocked. His warm and rough palms seemed to carry a seductive heat that immediately spread to the bottom of her heart. Shen Manting suddenly felt a little scared. She wanted to push him away, but he easily raised his hand and reached into her pajamas. Shin Luo's fingers skillfully and easily undid the buttons on her back. Shen Manting felt something loosen in front of her, and the aftershock made her tremble. She let out a soft moan. It was a little embarrassing, but Shen Manting couldn't help but tremble slightly under his skillful movements. Their bodies were tightly pressed together, and the scorching heat made Shen Manting blush. Hubby, Shen Manting called out softly, what do you want? Shin Luo's eyes were burning with passion. Hearing this, she said, didn't you ask me what is missing between us? Shen Manting thought about it for the whole day, but she still couldn't figure out what was missing between them. Shin Luo said these words softly. After a moment, he continued in a hoarse voice, do you know the most important difference between a husband and wife and a friend? Shen Manting was a little confused and shook her head. Chapter 2075. But, you just said, it's love, Shen Manting corrected him weakly. Her face was already flushed. Shin Luo stared at her and said softly, yes, it's called sex. Shen Manting's heart beat faster when she heard the word. She could also clearly feel that Shin Luo's heart was beating as fast as hers. Do you know what sex is? Shin Luo slightly narrowed his eyes. Shen Manting seemed to know, but also seemed to not know. The vague feeling made her shake her head again. Shin Luo did not explain, but directly took the computer and directly clicked on the screen that Shen Manting had just seen. He directly fast-forwarded the screen to the most important part, and shameful and intense sounds came from the computer. Shen Manting's head was buzzing, but she could not help but open her eyes wide and look at the screen. This is sex. Although Shin Luo's voice was low, it was very calm. Shen Manting looked at the image on the computer screen and suddenly felt even more uncomfortable. Especially, she wanted to be hubby. Shen Manting was a little afraid, but she could not help but look forward to it. Are you going to do these things to me too? Shen Luo, and had long been unable to resist, and his tight and hot body pressed against her. He could clearly smell the faint fragrance on her body, and the cute look in the corner of the screen, which made it even more difficult for him to control himself. His throat tightened and he slowly said, "If you are afraid, I will not force you." Shen Manting twisted her body, and a pair of big eyes flashed. Looking at the intense and dazzling scene on the screen, and the sound of slapping made her feel very uncomfortable. Feeling Shen Luo An's tension, she thought for a moment, and then said softly, "I am a little afraid, but yeah, I can do it with you. I want." Shen Luo and did not hide his desire, and deeply pressed against her to let his scorching heat pass to her, and said hoarsely, "But I am afraid." "You are also afraid." Shen Manting blushed, and her eyes were a little unfocused as she looked at the screen. "If you are also afraid, then let me help you." "Oh, so evil, so shameful." Shen Luo and reached out and closed the computer. All the light in the room had disappeared. Shen Manting turned around and looked at Shen Luo. "I'm afraid that you'll hate me." Shen Luo An's voice was low and almost ethereal. "I love you." Shen Manting looked at him earnestly and wrapped her arms around his neck. "I won't hate you." "Then marry me," Shen Luo and suddenly said. "Marry me, Manting." Shen Manting didn't know what he meant. Could it be that she had not married him yet? However, she had already given birth to the child. Why didn't she marry him? Shen Manting pondered for a moment and asked, "Isn't a husband a husband? Why do you want to marry again?" "No, it's not the same." Shen Luo and looked at her. "Will you marry me? You'll marry me for real. We'll have a wedding, a marriage, and to..." Shen Manting vaguely seemed to understand something. So they had no wedding, no marriage, no love? How could that be? Shen Manting looked at him with a puzzled look in her eyes. "Didn't you love me in the past?" Hearing this, Shen Luo and immediately said firmly, "Love." Chapter 2076. Shen Luo An's eyes darkened, and his throat choked. He twitched the corner of his mouth and asked, "Really?" Shen Manting nodded and looked at him firmly. "Although I don't remember a lot of things, when you say you love me, I feel very happy. And here." Shen Manting held his hand and placed it on her chest. She said shyly, "It hurts here. My heart hurts." Shen Luo and couldn't help but be intoxicated by her childlike innocence. At the same time, he felt that he was so despicable. She couldn't remember anything. She didn't know anything. He actually took the opportunity to get the answer he had been longing for a long time. He wanted her. She agreed. She said she loved him. She loved him very much. Although he knew that it was just a child's joke, he couldn't help but want to convince himself that it was true. It was true. He couldn't help but sink his body. Shen Luo An's hot kiss fell on her smooth and delicate skin. "Oh," Shen Manting whispered, "Honey, it's so ticklish." Shen Luo and didn't stop. He pulled down her pajama pants with his fingers and kissed her passionately and intensely, nibbling her inch by inch. Shen Manting couldn't help but wriggle. She hugged his head and bent her knees. When Shen Luo and took off the last of her clothes, the corners of his eyes were already wet. When she woke up one day, would she hate him? Or even hate him more than before? Shen Manting passively fiddled with his hands, and her hands climbed onto his. She endured his passionate kiss, and her body trembled slightly. She couldn't help but shout, "Honey, honey, yes." Shen Luo and hugged her and lifted her legs. He lowered his body and said, "I'm here." His voice was low and hoarse, and he couldn't hide his desire. Shen Manting's body tightened. She held him tightly and screamed, "Honey." Shen Luo and leaned down and covered her mouth. The hot kiss was overwhelming. She was surrounded by an indescribable passion. Shen Manting had never felt this way before. She was filled with longing, and she felt an urgent need. Her breathing became heavier and heavier, and her lips and teeth were pressed against his. The wonderful and sweet feelings spread all over her body. Soon she felt like she was being attacked. Shenmanting couldn't control herself and moaned in embarrassment. Shenluo and was so strong that she was firmly confined in his arms. She couldn't help but clamp her legs around him. Shenluo and took a deep breath. Relax. Shenmanting was still tense and shouted, Hubby, hubby, yes, I'm here. Shenluo and gritted his teeth and whispered into her ear, Manting. Hubby, don't hate me. Shenluo An's voice was so low that it was barely audible. Shenmanting's chest tightened, and she felt a little sad. There was no light in the room, but she could clearly see that the corners of his eyes were a little wet. His heart ached. Shenmanting wrapped her arms around his neck, lifted her face, and kissed him gently. I love you, she said. Shenluo and looked up and kissed her neck even more fiercely. His hands supported her left and right, as if he was afraid of hurting her. His movements were restrained and gentle. Even so, Shenmanting was still a little out of breath. She panted and said intermittently, I love you. Chapter 2077. Shenmanting didn't quite understand, but she believed that she would remember what she had said. Shenluo and didn't wait for her to speak and gradually stuffed her words back into her mouth. Shenmanting couldn't say another word except for a low moan that she couldn't help herself. The next day, the baby woke up early in the morning. Daddy! 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 The little baby didn't cry. It seemed that he wouldn't stop until he was called. Shenmanting slept soundly and her body was strangely sore. However, his heart was very satisfied, when she opened her eyes. Shenluo and had already gotten up. He put on his clothes, picked up the baby, and walked into the bathroom. Shenmanting glanced at him and subconsciously wanted to get up, but the layers of soreness on her body made her feel uncomfortable. He moved a little, but his whole body felt very uncomfortable. She looked down and saw a hideous scar on her chest. She pressed it and felt a little painful. She felt a little wronged and lay down again. Shenmanting felt uncomfortable everywhere. You're awake? Shenluo and had already put on his pants when he walked back with the baby in his arms. Shenmanting saw him and remembered how she felt last night. She immediately blushed, covered her face with the blanket and shrunk back. Shenluo and smiled. He let the baby wash up and walked out with the little guy in his arms. Outside, Mrs. Shin had already woken up. Shenluo and saw her and said, Mom, look after little Moon. I'm going to sleep for a while. Mrs. Shin looked at his bare-chested face and knew that there was something going on. Did he throw the baby out early in the morning and continue sleeping? Shenluo and wasn't someone who would laze around in bed. Mrs. Shin was a little happy. She took her grandson and waved her hand. Go, go, go. Shenluo and looked at the ambiguous smile on her face and felt a little embarrassed. But he didn't avoid it. He directly locked the child outside and then went in himself. Daddy? Little Moon had never encountered such a situation. He held the little toy in his hands and pouted. Grandma. Mrs. Shin bent down and picked up the little guy. Don't disturb Daddy and Mommy. Let's go. Grandma will take you shopping. Little Moon still looked unhappy. He glanced at the door of the room and followed Mrs. Shin out. Shenmanting curled up in bed and couldn't fall asleep. His body was very uncomfortable, but he felt very happy in his heart. The thick sweetness was like honey, thickly pasted in his heart. Shenmanting turned around when she heard the sound of the door being locked. She saw Shenluo and walking back. She shrank back and hugged herself completely under the blanket. Shenluo and chuckled when he saw this. He lifted the quilt and said, Are you hiding from me? Shenmanting screamed shyly and happily. Don't touch me. Yes, I won't touch you. Shenluo and pressed her down and said in a low voice, I want you. Shenmanting looked at him with bright eyes. When she heard this, she shrank back, but she was already ready to be slaughtered. When Shenluo and saw her like this, he couldn't help but recall that long-lost feeling. Last night, he had done it countless times. In the end, she had begged him not to do it anymore, so he had let her go. Now, Shenluo and leaned forward, pinned her down, and gave her a long, deep kiss. Chapter 2078. Her legs rubbed against him, and she was like a thunderbolt that ignited the fire in the ground. By the time it was over, Enchanting was exhausted. He held her in his arms and took a bath before she fell into a deep sleep. When she woke up, there was no one beside her. Inexplicably, she was a little flustered. Enchanting got up, looked around, and called out, "Hubby." Shenluo, Anne's voice came from the cloakroom. Soon she saw him dressed neatly. He was wearing a rare formal suit with a tie and a suit. He looked very handsome. Enchanting's gaze fell on the tie that he had tied. Shenluo and followed her gaze and chuckled. "What's wrong? I didn't know a tie was tied like this." Enchanting was a little frustrated and said, "I can tie it properly next time." Shenluo and laughed when he heard that. Soon he walked forward with a few beautiful women's clothes on his arm. Enchanting blinked and said, "Hubby, are you going to help me put on my clothes?" "Yes, get up quickly." Shenluo and responded and then put the clothes on the bed. Then he pulled her up. Enchanting's body was covered with his marks. It looked scary and ambiguous at the same time. Enchanting shyly covered her body and said with a red face, "Hubby, what are you going to do when you're dressed so handsomely today?" "Get up and put on your clothes first, and then I'll tell you." Enchanting was a little curious, but she still agreed. Facing his burning gaze, she felt even more ashamed. She reached out and pushed his face away, saying, "Don't look at me." Shenluo and chuckled but did not move away. He leaned over and kissed her deeply on the lips. "Don't be shy, I'll help you put on your clothes." "I don't want to." Enchanting shook her head. "I'll do it myself." "Turn your head away." Seeing this, Shenluo and did not insist and said, "In that case, all right." Shenluo and turned his back and packed up the computer from last night. After Enchanting was sure that he would not peek at her, she quickly put on her clothes. After putting on the dress that he brought over, she stood up and tidied it up. She said, "New clothes, hubby. Do they look good?" Shenluo and had already finished packing his things. When he heard this, he turned his head to look. It was early spring, and the weather outside was still very cold. Enchanting was wearing a pink chiffon dress, which made her look elegant and fairy-like. Shenluo Anne's eyes were a little intoxicated. His gaze was gentle as he gently brushed her hair aside. "Beautiful, very beautiful." Shenluo Anne was telling the truth. But such blatant praise made Enchanting feel even more embarrassed. Turning around, he picked up his coat and put it on. His coat was a beige coat that looked very clean and tidy. It looked rather dignified and elegant. "You're just too skinny." Shenluo Anne's heart ached for her. He looked at her and said, "You have to eat more meat." Enchanting turned around and combed her hair. "I've been eating meat every day. Dad, Mom, Grandma, Julia, and Qian all tell me to eat more meat. I've been eating, and I've become much fatter than before." Indeed, Enchanting looked much better than when she had just been discharged from the hospital. Her face finally looked a little rounder, but she was still thin. People couldn't help but feel sorry for her figure. However, after combing her hair, she suddenly remembered something. Chapter 2079. Enchanting blushed and quickly ran into the bathroom. However, her body was already sore, and after running, she couldn't stand it anymore. The strange pain and soreness in her legs almost made Enchanting lose her balance and fall. Shenluo and reached out to support her, and Enchanting's face became even redder. She shook him off and walked to the bathroom with strange footsteps. After closing the door, Enchanting looked in the mirror and found that her neck was full of densely packed marks. It looked a little spectacular, and Enchanting was successfully frightened. She poked it with her hand and felt a tingling pain. She soaked a towel in hot water and applied it for a while. Her skin was scalded red, but it didn't reduce at all. After washing up, it was already half an hour later. When Shen Luo saw her coming out, he said, "Come here." Shen Manting saw him holding a silk scarf in his hand, and her cheeks were red. She walked over and let him help her put on the silk scarf. After going out, Shen Luo led her to Mrs. Shen. Mrs. Shen was a little surprised and exclaimed, "Manting, why are you so beautiful today? Are you going out?" "Yes," Shen Luo replied and said, "Mom, do Manting's makeup. Just light makeup will do." "But what are you going to do?" Mrs. Shen smiled ambiguously and said, "You're dressed up so well. Are you going to meet someone? Or are you going to get married?" Shen Luo seemed a little embarrassed and said, "Don't worry about me. You can do her makeup first." Mrs. Shen didn't care and reached out to pull Shen Manting into her room. "Let's go. Manting's makeup skills were better than mine." Shen Manting walked in and saw a pile of brightly colored cosmetics on Mrs. Shen's dressing table. It looked vaguely familiar. After letting her do the foundation, Shen Manting was a little eager to try it out and said, "Mom, I'll try it myself." Mrs. Shen was all smiles. Sure enough, after a while, Shen Manting took matters into her own hands and put on her makeup. However, when she raised her hand, Mrs. Shen glanced at the deep and shallow marks on her neck. It looked quite hideous. When Shen Manting was rubbing her blush, she noticed her gaze and immediately felt a bang in her head. She quickly covered her neck with a silk handkerchief. Madame Shen was also an experienced person. She saw through him but didn't say anything. She said, "Your skills are still so good. Sigh, I can't do it." Shen Manting was a little embarrassed. She lowered her head and didn't speak. Shen Luo's eyes were filled with amazement when he walked out. Looking at Shen Manting like this, it was as if he was looking at the high-spirited younger sister of the past. In the past, Shen Manting would go out in a glamorous manner every day. She was very capable and was promoted very quickly. He was always dressed in office lady attire, looking mature and steady. But now, the way she looked at him seemed to be a little timid and shy. Her pure and innocent eyes made him feel even more pity for her. "Hubby, I'm done." Shen Manting noticed that he was in a daze and reminded him, "Where are we going?" Shen Luo seemed to come back to his senses and said, "Yes, let's go." As he spoke, he reached out to hold Shen Manting's palm. Shen Manting's cheeks were red as she followed him into the car. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.